Hi guys! Tonight we slip quietly into a city that you think you already know, a place of top hats, gas lamps, and neat sepia photographs, and then we start peeling back the surface until London feels more like a living animal breathing around you in the dark. You stand at the edge of it listening before you move, because the sounds come first. Hooves clatter, cartwheels grind over uneven stones. Someone shouts at a costermonger to move his barrow, and from somewhere behind you, a window opens with a squeak and closes again as a curious face decides you're not worth the draught of cold night air. You probably will not survive this version of Victorian London if you arrive with only the soft, polite images from costume dramas to protect you. The real city presses closer, wetter, and less patient. It smells of coal smoke that never quite clears from your hair, of horse sweat, of cabbage boiling behind thin brick walls. Somewhere close, a public house door swings open and a gust of warm, sour beer air rolls out. Somewhere else, a church bell insists that this is still a respectable Christian city, even while the alley beside it fills with whispers and bargains that have nothing to do with virtue. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're settling in, if you want to let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. You're standing in the chill of a London evening, but someone else may be listening from a bright afternoon kitchen or a quiet night bus, and those tiny connections stretch like invisible wires between centuries. Now dim the lights. You start to walk one careful step into the 19th century, and the pavement feels slightly greasy under your boots, as if years of soot droppings and spilled street food have woven themselves into a permanent film that no amount of civic pride can really scrub away. One solid fact that museum panels like to mention is the sheer scale of this place. By the middle of the century, more than 2.5 million people are packed into London, and by the end, over 6.5 million. That makes it the largest city on earth at the time, a swelling, breathing mass of humanity that needs feeding, housing, cleaning, and policing every single day. Yet most people do not live inside the respectable engravings. They live in cramped courts and back lanes behind shop fronts and above workshops. And this is the London you're moving through now. Gas lamps line the main streets, but the light they give is not the clear, reliable glow of modern bulbs. It is uneven, soft at the edges, turning fog into a halo and shadows into full companions. Under that light, you see faces that would never sit for portraits because they are too busy or too tired or not considered important enough to be remembered. Some scholars are not in full agreement about what to even call this city that surrounds you. There is a quiet debate over whether it makes sense to talk about one single Victorian London at all, or whether you should imagine a loose collection of overlapping Londons divided by class, work, ethnicity, gender, and sheer luck. You feel that argument in your feet as you turn a corner and the mood changes. On one street, polished boots and handsome cabs. On the next, barefoot children and the smell of rotting vegetables near a market that has already closed for the day. A small odd detail that rarely makes it into school lessons waits for you as you pass a row of narrow houses. You notice little pots of carbolic or vinegar on windowsills and rags soaked in scented water tucked near doorways. Some households keep these to try to cleanse the air, to tame the stink that filters up from drains and streets. Others hang bunches of dried herbs, convinced that a bit of lavender or rosemary can fight off the invisible threats lingering in the smog. It is a reminder that people here do not simply submit to the filth. They improvise, fuss, and experiment with humble tools, trying to make an overwhelming city feel a little less hostile. You pause near a crossroads where 4 streets spill together like streams into a shallow basin of noise. A newspaper boy cries out headlines about distant battles and political scandals, his voice already hoarse despite his age. A woman with a basket of limp flowers offers a few stems to a passing clerk, who hesitates long enough for you to see the tension in his shoulders, between thrift and a small bright indulgence. A cabman argues with a fare about the route taken, both of them, sure that the other is lying. The arguments here are mundane, but they carry the weight of people who do not have much spare money or patience to lose. You are learning quickly that Victorian London is less about the big singular events that make it into documentaries and more about layers of ordinary strain. There are reforms acts of Parliament, sanitary campaigns, and philanthropic missions that you could list like stepping stones, and it is true that the city has major projects, such as the Great Sewer System, built after the famous Great Stink of 1858. Yet what you feel in your bones tonight is not the timeline of improvement. It is the slow, grinding background of people trying to get through one more day, while the city grows faster than anyone can quite control. Some modern writers like to reassure you that progress marched steadily forward. Here, that charity, technology, and moral seriousness gradually lifted everyone. Other researchers are more skeptical and stress how much suffering persisted behind the statistics. You stand in that uncertainty, watching a lamplighter work his way down the street, touching each lamp with a practiced gesture, and you sense that both perspectives might be half true. Yes, some things improved. Yes, many people still fell through the cracks. As you turn again, slipping into a narrower lane, the street widens into a feeling of being watched and yet ignored at the same time. No one stops you. No one welcomes you. They simply fold you into the moving mass, and you realize how easy it would be to vanish into this city, to become another figure in the half-light. Your footsteps echo softly in rhythm with dozens of others, and the noise rises and falls like slow breathing. Somewhere behind you, a child laughs. Somewhere ahead, a door slams, and above you, wash lines sway slightly against a smoky sky. You are now ready to learn what the streets themselves can tell you about class status and quiet borders. If you listen with your nose and your skin as much as with your ears, you step back out of the narrow lane and into a broader street, and immediately your ears are less useful than your nose. Victorian London is very good at pretending to be a single city on a printed map, but your body begins to discover that it is actually many small worlds stitched together by smells and surfaces. You do not need a guidebook to tell you whether you're drifting toward money or away from it. Your feet and lungs already know. On a better kept street in the West End, the paving under you has a firmer, more even feel. The stones are well set, the gutters are a little better defined, and rainwater has somewhere respectable to go. The air here carries coal smoke, like everywhere else, but it rides in on a different company. You catch hints of polished wood and lamp oil, of expensive soaps lingering on clothes, of cooked meat escaping from club kitchens. Perfume arrives in sudden gusts tied to individual bodies rather than the whole street. Once you turn away and thread toward working-class districts, all of that begins to thin out. The paving becomes patchy and more rutted, and sometimes gives way to packed earth that turns to clinging mud in bad weather. Your boots meet puddles that do not look or smell like clean rainwater. The smoke above you is thicker and harsher, often mixed with the tang of industrial chimneys and the sourness of overcrowded rooms being aired for a moment. It is here that you learn to read a neighbourhood with your eyes half closed. A basic fact that appears in many studies of the period is that poverty was not evenly scattered. It clustered. Whole zones of London became known for chronic overcrowding and low wages, while others concentrated wealth and display. Reformers drew attention to districts like Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, or parts of Southwark as examples of urban neglect, and their descriptions of dim courts and airless tenements still help researchers glimpse how severe the contrasts could be. Yet those official accounts usually tidy the sensory reality. They count rooms and incomes. Your body notices the sting in your nostrils instead. You pass a court where washing hangs so low you could almost taste the soap on your tongue as you brush by. Laundry day is an anchor in many homes, but here it also acts as cheap air freshener. Shirts, petticoats, and ragged trousers drip leftover suds into the street, forming little streams that try and fail to chase away the underlying smell of refuse. It is a very modest battle against a much larger background of rot and damp. You realise as you keep walking that class here is not just about what people own. It is about what they have to put up with on their way to work, on their way home, and at every moment in between. In more comfortable quarters, the smells that reach you tend to be individual and temporary: a bakery, a tobacconist, a passing lady with too much cologne. In poorer areas, scent is more like weather, a continuous background made from many small sources that never quite disperse. Researchers who focus on urban geography do not fully agree on how hard these boundaries actually were. Some emphasize that servants, messengers, and street sellers constantly crossed them carrying news goods, and gossip between rich and poor streets. Others stress that respectable households and exclusive clubs tried very carefully to regulate who could loiter near their doors, sometimes using architectural tricks like railings, alcoves, and entry passages to make access less casual. As you drift along, you can sense both arguments breathing together. Movement is possible, but comfort and risk are distributed unequally. You turn into a mews behind a line of tall houses, and suddenly you're standing in what feels like the backstage of respectability. The fronts of these homes face a wide, tidy street with shining windows and neatly swept steps. Back here, horses stamp in cramped stables, grooms shout at each other over the clatter of buckets, and the smell is frankly agricultural. Manure piles up straw sticks to your boots, and the air is warm and steamy, in contrast to the chill outside the archway. It is a reminder that the wealthier parts of London rest on very physical labour and very physical dirt kept out of sight, but never entirely removed. One little oddity that amuses you once you notice it is the presence of crossing sweepers near busy junctions. These are usually children or very poor adults who scrape away mud and filth with a small broom, clearing a narrow path across the street in exchange for tips. Guidebooks of the time sometimes mention them in a sentimental tone, but when you stand and watch for a minute, you see how carefully customers choose where to walk. A careless cart, a splashing wheel, or a sudden argument can still send muck flying. Even here, class shows up in who can afford to look annoyed when their boots are spoiled. Light also tells you where you stand. In wealthy districts, lamps are spaced more generously, and shop windows spill golden rectangles across the pavement after dark. You can see far enough ahead to feel relatively secure. In poorer corners, a single failing lamp must stretch its glow over an entire junction, leaving pockets of shadow where people can slip in and out of sight. There is an ongoing discussion among social historians about how far lighting reforms really changed nightly safety and behaviour. Some argue that more illumination genuinely reduced certain crimes and made streets feel more open. Others suggest that criminals simply adjusted and that fear itself did not vanish, merely shifted to new corners. Standing here, you sense how both caution and opportunity thrive at the edges of visibility. Eventually, without reading a single street sign, you find that you can tell roughly where you are on the social map just by closing your eyes and breathing. If the air carries polished brass, roasted meat, and cigar smoke, you are closer to comfort. If it offers damp plaster, sour beer, cabbage water, and smoke that scratches your throat, you have slipped back toward hardship. Somewhere between those extremes lies an ever-shifting middle made of clerks, small shopkeepers and artisans, who fret daily about sliding down the slope into trouble. In this way, Victorian London teaches you that class is not just a line drawn in a census book. It is a full-body experience, written in grit on your cuffs and in soot in your lungs. You start to understand why social observers of the time kept returning to the metaphor of the city as an organism with arteries, nerves, and diseased patches. You are walking across its skin, now feeling the temperature change from block to block, and you realise that to really know this place, you have to let it into your nose and into the soles of your feet. By the time you have learned to read the streets with your nose and your boots, it is almost a relief to step indoors. Almost. You duck through a narrow doorway off a side lane, and the air that greets you is thicker than anything outside, dense with breath and steam and old fabric. For a moment it feels warmer, almost welcoming, and then your skin realizes that this warmth has nowhere to go. It simply stays here cycle after cycle, night after night. You are standing in a respectable enough house, by local standards, a multi-storey building that an official might simply label as a tenement or a lodging house. On paper, it is a normal address. On the inside, it is a layered container for human bodies. Wooden stairs run up under your hand, smooth and tacky from years of touch. Every landing holds several doors, and behind each door is another version of the same story. Too many people, too little space. One solid point that inquiry reports at the time repeat is that overcrowding was not a vague complaint. It was measured, counted, and occasionally condemned. In some poorer districts, surveyors recorded entire families sleeping, cooking, and working in a single room with lodgers squeezed in as an extra source of rent. Reformers used the phrase "more than 2 people per room" as a basic warning sign, and in parts of London, that threshold was not an exception. It was the norm. You feel what that statistic means as you step into one of those rooms and your shoulders seem to touch furniture that does not quite have enough room to exist. Your eyes adjust to the low light. A double bed fills one wall, its mattress slumping in the middle like a tired animal. A smaller truckle bed hides beneath it, ready to be pulled out when night comes fully. A makeshift hammock of old sacking hangs from hooks, promising a narrow swaying corner of sleep to someone who is paid for exactly that. Every surface has another use. The table is for meals and mending, and sometimes for laying out a body for washing when someone dies. The chair is for sitting, and also for that extra person who cannot lie down until someone else gets up. Privacy here is a luxury so rare it almost does not exist as a concept. You notice almost immediately how closely everyone must manage their own bodies in such a room. Smell is inescapable. Clothes that have seen too many days of work without washing are hung on a line strung above the bed, dripping occasional droplets of grey water onto the blankets. A pot of something like stew simmers gently on a small stove, fighting a losing battle against the underlying sense of sweat-damp boots and the sour tang of chamber pots waiting for morning. In this close air, a cough is not just a sound. It is a shared event, a small cloud of worry that everyone inhales. There is a curious little detail mentioned in some accounts of cheap lodging houses that makes you blink when you imagine it. In the very poorest places, some people did not pay for an entire bed at all. They paid for a portion of one, or for what was sometimes called a DOS arrangement, where they slept sitting up, leaning forward over a rope stretched across the room, using it as a human rail. Others practiced hot bedding, where one worker would climb out of a still warm bed at dawn, and another would climb straight in. It is the kind of arrangement that polite visitors barely wanted to write about, because it said too much about how little space and rest a body could be granted. When you think of history books with clean diagrams and floor plans, you might imagine these rooms as simple rectangles with labelled furniture. Living inside them is nothing like that. Every body has needs that do not pause simply because space is limited. People menstruate, give birth, nurse infants, dress wounds, and deal with the less glamorous sides of digestion in these cramped interiors. Curtains, if there are any, are thin and short. A blanket hung across a rope might carve out a temporary corner for washing, or for a couple who want a little privacy. The sense that you are always observed, that someone is always half awake, only a few feet away, is the water this household swims in. Scholars who study domestic life are not entirely united in their reading of how people experience that lack of privacy. Some emphasize resilience and adaptation, pointing to letters and memories, where former tenants look back and describe such closeness as simply how things were neither pleasant nor unbearable, just normal. Others draw attention to evidence of conflict, of sudden outbursts and quiet tensions, and argue that the emotional strain must have been deeper than people could safely admit. Academic studies remain divided over how much later nostalgia smooths the rough edges of what it really felt like to never be alone. You find your gaze drawn to the small improvised storage systems around you. A box under the bed holds everything that belongs to one lodger. A nail in the wall is the entire wardrobe of another. A single shared comb sits on the washstand, its missing teeth, a faint record of hard use. This is where lice and bed bugs thrive, small unwelcome residents that contemporary health officials did sometimes mention but rarely managed to eliminate. One medical commentator compared certain lodging houses to breeding grounds for invisible armies, more dangerous in their own slow way than any riot. It is not a pretty image, but your skin itches in agreement. A quieter, stranger tidbit surfaces as you listen to a woman explain her housekeeping routine. She tells you how she sprinkles tea leaves or damp sawdust on the floor before sweeping to keep the dust from rising in choking clouds. Others recommend scattering damp sand. Guidebooks for the working poor offered such tips as a kind of practical kindness, and they reveal an everyday knowledge of managing filth that rarely appears in grand narratives of empire and industry. You can almost feel the grit under your boots as she demonstrates turning clouds of potential dust into a heavy, manageable clump. Night in this room is not the simple darkness you might imagine from a painting of a Victorian interior. It is a slow rearrangement. The table is pushed aside. The truckle bed comes out. Boots are lined carefully near the wall in the hope that no thief or rat will disturb them. Children are wedged toward the warmer side, near other bodies. Adults negotiate who sleeps where, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with weary familiarity. Someone snores almost instantly. Someone else lies awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building breathe, and the street noises creep in through thin glass. There is a widely accepted fact among housing historians that official standards of what counts as crowded changed over time. What a late 20th century public health officer would condemn as unacceptable might have been shrugged at in 1850 or tolerated as unavoidable in 1880. Yet when you stand in this room and imagine trying to be ill here, trying to grieve here, trying to argue or reconcile, or simply think here, you sense that there is a difference between what a government inspector will record and what a tired heart can bear. You notice how carefully people also curate their own silence. A mother pretends not to hear certain noises after dark. Children learn not to ask why someone crept out at odd hours, or why two adults spoke in voices that were too low to catch. In this way, entire layers of Victorian life become habits of not mentioning things. Later historians searching for written evidence find less than they expect, not because nothing happened, but because the people who lived it learned to fold those realities into an agreed quiet. As you step back toward the door, you carry with you the feel of this room, its thick air, and its unending audience of neighbours. You begin to understand that when someone in Victorian London talks about home, they might be referring to a space where the idea of privacy is more hope than reality, and yet in that tight space, people cook, sing, quarrel, fall in love, recover from shock, and slide into sleep every night. The city outside may be mapped by streets and smells, but the true measure of Victorian London is also in these crowded rooms, where bodies crease the mattresses and ghosts of conversation cling to the walls. You go back out onto the landing, knowing that once you have breathed this air, the elegant houses of the West End and the neat drawings in history books can never again tell you the whole story. On the landing, doors creak, soft voices bleed through thin wood, And then you realise something the polite drawings of Victorian interiors almost never show. For all these bodies piled on top of one another, there is no bathroom. Your modern mind keeps trying to tuck one in beside the bedroom, to imagine tiles and a little window and a lock. The building simply refuses to supply it. Instead, the truth of where people actually relieve themselves settles around you like an extra layer of smell. You follow the slosh of water and the shuffle of slippers down the stairs past a landing where a chamber pot sits outside a door, waiting to be emptied. Its chipped rim and stained sides ask you not to look too closely. Someone has balanced a saucer over the top in a small effort at modesty. You trail one of the tenants out through a back passage into a cramped yard hemmed in by brick on all sides. Here at last is what passes for a toilet for several households at once. A small brick structure squats in the corner with a wooden door that does not quite close and a faint buzzing of flies that apparently do not believe in winter. Inside, a simple seat planks over a pit or a cesspool, and a smell that has been building for weeks rises to greet you like an old acquaintance. Records from the time consistently show that such shared privies were the standard arrangement for much of working-class London well into the 19th century, even as water closets and flush systems spread through wealthier homes. Reformers wrote indignant paragraphs about a dozen or more families relying on a single filthy convenience, and about slops and human waste tossed into open drains or ditches. On paper, it becomes statistics and recommendations. Standing here, you feel instead a daily shuffle and negotiation of whose turn it is who can wait and who dares the yard after dark. You learn quickly that there is a quiet choreography to all of this. People time their visits to the privy according to light safety and shyness as much as to bodily need. Women may wait until the yard feels emptier. Children are sent in twos and threes, partly for company, partly for the extra set of hands to hold a candle. Men sometimes simply step into a corner aiming for a wall or a drain, trusting the city to swallow the evidence. None of this appears on respectable visitor itineraries, and yet every person you pass has their own mental map of safe spots and emergency options. Academic debates often circle around whether Londoners were more tolerant of smells and filth than modern people, or whether they were simply resigned to what they could not change, while still disliking it intensely. Some researchers argue that Victorian noses were genuinely desensitized by constant exposure to coal smoke manure and decaying matter. Others insist that contemporary complaints about stenches and miasmas show a population every bit as disgusted as you would be, just with fewer tools to escape. You follow another thread of the story back indoors into the small room you visited earlier. Here the chamber pot is not an occasional backup. It is a central member of the household. At night, it sits under the bed or in a corner, saving everyone the trouble and danger of going out. In the morning, someone is assigned to carry it downstairs, past neighbours and cooking smells, and into the privy or slop area for emptying. Sometimes that task falls to the youngest, sometimes to whoever is already up. You imagine the particular humiliation of being the one who spilled it on the stairs. One well-documented detail from the period is that large parts of the city relied on cesspits and primitive drains for far longer than you might expect for a capital of empire. Even after great engineering works began to introduce comprehensive sewers, not every street or court was connected immediately. It took years for the network to spread, and in the meantime, overflowing pits could leak into nearby wells or cellars. Health officials worried about contaminated water spreading diseases such as cholera, and those worries were not theoretical. Repeated outbreaks haunted the city, turning every glass of pump water into a small gamble. At the same time, inventors and householders tried experiments to make human waste more manageable. One curious little custom you might not expect is the adoption of earth closets. In some places where instead of flushing with water, people sprinkle dry earth or ash over their deposits to absorb smell and create compost. Pamphlets sang the praises of this method as economical and sanitary, especially where water supply was unreliable. You picture someone in a tiny London yard, carefully tending a pile that is part garden, part latrine, and you suddenly understand why such schemes did not become universal. There is an awkward silence in many neat historical summaries about what women in particular did when they were away from home for long hours. Servants could sometimes rely on the back spaces of the houses where they worked. Factory workers and shop girls had to navigate a patchwork of grudgingly provided facilities, improvised corners, and strategic self-denial. Reformers occasionally mentioned the need for decent conveniences for women in public spaces, but it took a long time for that idea to turn into reliable brick and mortar. You start to see how half the experiences in this city are edited out simply because nobody wanted to put them plainly into official reports. Experts continue to dispute how far this bodily precariousness shaped behaviour in ways that are hard to measure. Did people limit their journeys, avoid certain jobs, or structure social visits around access to a usable privy? Some argue that it must have had a powerful influence on daily choices, especially for women, the elderly, and those with chronic illnesses. Others caution that the surviving evidence is too thin to justify bold claims. Still, when you imagine setting out across the city, knowing there may be nowhere decent to go for hours, you find yourself unconsciously shortening your own imagined walks. You leave the cramped yard and drift back to the main street, suddenly more aware of every dark archway and side alley. You notice how often you see liquid trickling along gutters, sometimes clear, sometimes suspiciously cloudy, carrying away what the buildings cannot hold. As you move on, the official story of Victorian progress begins to look less like a simple line of improvement and more like a tug of war between engineering money habit and the stubborn realities of human bodies. The grand sewers and clean water campaigns are undeniably impressive. Yet beneath them and before them, there was all this improvisation, concealment, and shared tolerance of discomfort. You tuck this knowledge away as you head toward the next corner of the city, understanding that to really know Victorian London, you have to start with the most basic question of all. Where could you actually go when you needed to go? You only need a few more streets before you start noticing clothes in a different way. Not as costume, not as neat outfits on mannequins, but as a kind of armour that people put on and then cannot easily take off again. You look around and realise that jackets, shawls and boots here are not changed with every mood. They stay on until the season itself decides to move on, or until the fabric simply gives up. You step closer to a working man hurrying past his boots, leaving a faint line of damp prints on the pavement. The leather is cracked and whitened with old salt, and you can almost feel how long his feet have been trapped inside. Socks, if he has them at all, may be on their second or third day. Trousers shine at the knees where use has polished the cloth, and the cuffs pick up the city like a brush carrying home tiny fragments of horse-dung ash and mud. All of it travels indoors with him at night, and never fully leaves. Official surveys from the 19th century make it clear that many poorer Londoners owned very few garments. One set of decent clothes might be reserved for Sundays and special occasions, while work clothes took the brunt of everything else. For some, even that distinction was a luxury. Inspectors noted families where each person had only a single change of underwear, if that and where washing day meant a complicated dance of nudity, borrowed items, and waiting for things to dry by smoky fires. When you picture that the idea of tossing a shirt in a modern washing machine starts to feel like an extravagant fantasy, you follow a woman carrying a heavy bundle toward a public washhouse. Inside, heat and steam hit you like a solid wall, carrying the sharp scent of wet soap sweat and old stains being coaxed back to life. Rows of women and girls bend over tubs, their sleeves rolled up fingers, reddened by hot water and harsh powders. This is what it actually takes to keep garments even slightly respectable in a city like this. Laundry is labour noisy and exhausting, and for many households, it means paid work done outside the home. Clean clothes become not just a sign of morality, as the sermons like to say, but also a sign that you can afford time money and muscle power. You learn that there is an entire economy built on clothing that has already lived one or two lives. Second-hand shops display piles of jackets, boots and dresses, some carefully brushed and mended, others clinging to their history too stubbornly to be fully revived. A slightly offbeat scrap of evidence appears in the form of pawnbrokers who recorded endless cycles of clothes being pawned on Monday to pay for food and redeemed on Saturday, so families could go to church looking decent. Your shirt becomes not just something you wear, but something you can convert into bread for a few days and then try to reclaim before it disappears for good. Textiles specialists today do not completely agree on how often garments were washed versus simply brushed, aired and shaken out. Some emphasize the high cost of fuel and soap, arguing that for many people, full immersion in water was reserved for linen closest to the skin, while outer layers were only occasionally sponged. Others point to household advice manuals that urged more frequent washing for health and suggest that at least some families managed it more often than the stereotype allows. You stand between these interpretations, sniffing the air on a crowded omnibus, and suspect that the truth probably varied sharply from one street to the next. You become newly aware of the way fabrics hold onto the city. Wool absorbs smoke and sweat, then slowly releases them again when it warms by the fire. Cotton shirts marked with faded starch lines grow stiff in the morning and slump by night, carrying the faint smell of the river water they were rinsed in. Heavy skirts sweep the streets like brooms, soaking up moisture and grit that later dries into a grey dust. Even when people try their best, dirt has a talent for coming back. It hides in seams under collars behind buttons. One small but memorable oddment from everyday life surfaces when you notice the chalky marks on certain jackets and pinafores. Some workers, especially in messy trades, kept a good garment for the journey home and covered it with an apron or sacking during the day. Others turned coats inside out to protect the less worn side. In a few descriptions you read of children being wrapped in old grown-up clothes to save their own from stains walking home, like little ghosts in oversized sleeves. It is a strange practical theatre of fabric that makes even the walk between work and home part of the battle against grime. You cannot ignore skin either. If clothes are rarely washed, bodies share the same burden. Public baths and wash houses exist, but they cost money and time. Some people sponge themselves at home with a cloth and a bowl. Others make do with occasional plunges in rivers or canals when the weather permits. Reformers worried about disease often linked cleanliness with morality, writing stern lines about dirty faces as signs of vice. Yet when you stand in a room where 4 people share a single small basin and a cracked mirror, you understand that virtue is not the limiting factor. Space and resources are. There is still no common verdict among social historians on how self-conscious Londoners were about the constant film of the city on their bodies. Some diaries and letters suggest a brisk acceptance, a sense that soot and smell was simply part of life to be brushed off as best one could. Other voices complain bitterly about never feeling quite clean, about clothes that itch and stick, about hair that never completely loses its dusty feel. The surviving evidence pulls in both directions, leaving you with the sense that comfort and resignation probably coexisted uneasily in most households. As daylight fades and lamps flare up, you watch a mother turn a child's coat right side out, give it a final shake, and smooth the creases with a flattened hand before sending them out on an errand. For a moment the garment looks almost new, Then the child runs, splashes through a puddle, brushes against a passing cart, and the illusion collapses back into wrinkles and splashes. Victorian London leaves its fingerprints on everyone who walks its streets. Cloth becomes a diary, written not in ink, but in stains thinning patches, and the faint, stubborn smell of a city that clings. You start to understand why people guarded certain items of clothing with almost fierce tenderness, why a good pair of boots could be the difference between steady work and slow disaster, why a clean collar might unlock small chances that a ragged one would block. In this city, clothes are not just fashion. They are armour admission tickets and second skins all at once, and they rarely get the luxury of rest. You step back into the street and immediately catch the soft, rhythmic drag of tired feet. Victorian London does not politely separate work from the rest of life, the way modern schedules try to. Here, labour bleeds into every hour, shaping how people stand, how they breathe, and how they speak by the time night falls. You begin to walk beside a carpenter, then a kitchen maid, then a costermonger, and you start to feel how the city insists on claiming their bodies long before their wages arrive. The carpenter is up before dawn, sharpening tools by candlelight in a room where children still sleep in a jumble of limbs. His hands already ache before he leaves the house. The kitchen maid you follow is awake even earlier, padding down cold steps behind a grand townhouse while respectable families sleep upstairs. She carries the stiffness of yesterday in her shoulders. By the time the costermonger joins the street with his apple barrow, the city is yawning open, and thousands of workers pour out like a slow tide. Writers of the period often pointed out how long the working day could stretch. 12-hour shifts were normal, in many trades sometimes longer for servants, dock workers, and textile labourers. Factories rang with clattering machines from early morning until late evening, while shop workers stood for hours behind counters without the luxury of sitting. If you had steady work, exhaustion was part of the bargain. If you did not, wandering the city, hunting for jobs, was just as draining. You pause at a construction site, where men haul bricks and mortar up wooden scaffolds that sway in the wind. Their footwork is quick, their balance automatic, but the repetition gradually wears down knees and backs. A labourer mutters about Saturdays being the only day when the pace eases, yet even then repairs, and errands often fill the hours. You watch him wipe sweat from his forehead, despite the chill outside. The job demands strength, and it drains him faster than he can rebuild it. There is a quieter group of workers you almost miss at first. Needlewomen bent over small rooms, stitching piece after piece for long stretches. Their pay is irregular, often insultingly low, and you hear whispered worries about missed deadlines that will reduce their already thin earnings. One well-documented detail from the time is that piecework often encouraged punishing hours. Women sometimes sewed late into the night by dim candlelight essuies, straining fingers, cramping the heat of the flame, warming one side of their face while the rest of the room stayed cold. Researchers remain divided on the question of how working-class Londoners balanced rest with survival. Some argue that many people carved out small islands of leisure through pubs, music halls, church outings, and street games. Others suggest these moments were fleeting, overwhelmed by constant fatigue. You watch a young man hesitating outside a pub door, calculating whether the cost of a pint is worth the loss of tomorrow's breakfast. His posture tells you that fun is not a given here. It is a negotiation. As you continue walking, you notice strange little survival strategies that rarely appear in polite histories. One curious, everyday habit, rarely mentioned in formal reports, involves workers quietly padding the insides of worn boots with scraps of newspaper. It takes the edge off blisters for a few hours and absorbs some of the damp that seeps in from the street. Another trick you spot is a dock labourer rubbing goose fat on his hands, before work forming a cheap, greasy barrier against cold water and splinters. These are not sentimental details. They are tools for staying functional. Inside a warm bakery courtyard, You follow a delivery boy juggling baskets. His day begins before sunrise and ends past dusk. He snatches bites of stale bread between deliveries and sometimes naps briefly on sacks of flour. People later reminisce about Victorian childhoods with rose-tinted fondness, but watching this boy run with numb fingers and a tight jaw makes you wonder how much nostalgia edits out. For him, work is not a charming apprenticeship. It is exhaustion with training wheels. A maid hurries by, next clutching a stack of linens that smell faintly of lavender and long days by the wash tub. Domestic service is one of the largest employment sectors for women in the city, and the hours are demanding. Many maids are on their feet from before sunrise to after their employers go to bed. They snatch brief rests while polishing silver or folding laundry, but true leisure barely exists. When they finally climb to their attic rooms, their legs tremble from the day's relentless climbing of stairs. Interpretations vary sharply among modern researchers on how heavily this physical strain shaped people's emotional lives. Some suggest that constant tiredness muted conflict, leaving people too worn down for dramatic arguments. Others claim the opposite, arguing that fatigue heightened tempers and made minor slights feel heavier. When you stand among workers streaming home, their faces sagging with use, you sense that both interpretations hold pieces of the truth. Tired bodies can go quiet or they can flare. It depends on the day. It depends. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee the way posture reveals occupation. Carters lean slightly forward from hours of hauling loads. Seamstresses have rounded shoulders from years at the stitching table. Coal heavers walk bow-legged under the memory of weight. Clerks hold their pens even after they leave the office, fingers curled in invisible writing. A whole city drifts past you, shaped by invisible work long before night falls. Even meals bend to the workday. Many people eat when they cannot when they want to. A midday dinner might be nothing more than a chunk of bread and a smear of dripping. You watch a group of match girls in the East End, sharing a tin of weak tea and a small paper parcel of potatoes. The steam fogs the cold air for a moment before thinning away. They laugh, but their eyes look older than their years. You feel how hunger shadows even the jokes. Factories empty in waves, sending tired workers into the streets as the light fades. A few manage to joke as they walk. Most lower their heads against the wind, instinctively, conserving energy. One man coughs so sharply he has to pause against a wall. Another presses a hand into his lower back. The city is full of small private pains carried silently under layers of fabric. A slightly eccentric practice mentioned in passing by contemporary observers catches your attention near the river. Some labourers sleep sitting up in pubs between shifts, paying for a pint simply to gain a warm seat for an hour. The landlord pretends not to notice. It is an unspoken contract. Warmth and rest are commodities, and people buy slivers of them whenever they can. As lamps brighten overhead, you watch a seamstress lock up her tiny shop, rubbing her temples. The job has followed her into her bones. She walks home slowly, her gait revealing exactly where the needlework has taken its toll. Victorian London prides itself on industry and productivity, but you can feel the cost in every street corner. Before you move on, you stand still and listen to the sounds of the city settling into its evening rhythm. Not peaceful exactly, more like a long sigh that rolls across rooftops. London is not a machine that stops at closing time. It pushes its people until daylight returns and then begins again. You carry this rhythm with you as you turn toward the next dim street, already sensing that the city will ask even more of women whose labour hides behind respectability and silence. You turn down a quieter street where footsteps soften and voices drop, and a new rhythm of the city begins to unfold. If you have been paying close attention, you may have already sensed that women's work in Victorian London forms an entire second map, layered beneath the visible one. The official world turns on male wages, male trades, male politics, and male voices in newspapers. Yet the city would fall apart within a week without the labour women perform behind doors under stairs and in rooms no visitor ever praises. You follow a housewife stepping out of her narrow doorway, her shawl held tight against the morning chill. She is not headed to a workplace with a neat sign above the door. Her tasks stretch across markets, kitchens, laundry lines, and the unending management of family survival. Documents from the period make it clear that many married women worked informally, piecing together income through sewing, cooking for lodgers, selling scraps of goods, or taking in washing. None of it earns a line in public records, yet her entire day is an unbroken chain of labour. Inside her home, you see how much calculation hides beneath calm routines. She decides which food can be stretched, which child can be spared for errands, which coin can be held back in case her husband's wages come late or light. Domestic order, at least in respectable households, is meant to look effortless. In reality, it is a relentless negotiation with time fatigue and anxiety. She peels potatoes with fingers that carry tiny burns from kettles and ovens. She mends a tear in her son's shirt while her mind runs through the next 5 chores. There remains scholarly uncertainty about how much freedom housewives actually had over their own schedules. Some researchers argue that women controlled the rhythms of household life and wielded quiet power within their walls. Others suggest they moved inside invisible cages shaped by poverty, childcare demands, and social expectations. Standing here, listening to the tightness of this woman's breathing as she stirs a pot while soothing a crying toddler, you sense pieces of truth in both directions. You follow her to an upper room where a widow is bent over a sewing machine, the treadle thumping steadily beneath her feet. One firmly attested feature of the era is that thousands of widows, deserted wives, and unmarried women relied on needlework to survive. Shirts, collars, dresses, and undergarments are stitched in small spaces paid by the piece, each seam earning only pennies. When you stand close enough, you hear the metallic click of the needle, punctuating the silence like a heartbeat. The work looks delicate, but feels like endurance. Hours pass, light fades. Her hands do not stop. Beside her sits a younger woman, who moonlights as a laundress scrubbing shirts in a tin tub. A faintly eccentric routine reported at the time described how some laundresses tested water temperature, not with their hands, but with quick taps of their elbows, a trick to avoid burns. Watching her, you realise the tip is real. She dips her elbow to judge the heat nods, then plunges the fabric in. Her fingers are already red and puckered from previous loads. Modern historians approach the matter from sharply differing angles when analysing women's agency in such settings. Some emphasise resilience, pointing to women who handled finances, negotiated with landlords, or organised neighbourhood networks to share childcare and food. Others highlight vulnerability, showing how debts, illness, and predatory employers could trap women in desperate cycles. You stand in the room feeling the weight of the air, and it is difficult to imagine any single narrative capturing all these contradictions. When night edges close, you follow the roads that lead to another form of women's labour, the one historians often discuss in carefully distanced tones. You step onto a busier street, where women lean against lampposts or walk slowly in pairs, their eyes sharpened by caution and experience. This world is not polite, and unlike the sewing room, it cannot pretend to be hidden. The city glares at them, and yet depends on their presence to absorb certain pressures it refuses to name aloud. Contemporary observers repeatedly noted that sex work in Victorian London spanned all classes. Some operated from brothels with attendants and regular clients. Others walked the streets because they had no other workable option. You see a young woman with a frayed shawl chatting with an older one who gives advice with the air of a seasoned professional. Their voices are low but direct, They talk about policemen to avoid corners that are safe for clients who pay and clients who lie. There is no moral sermon here, just survival. Some researchers question the extent to which women in this trade exercised agency. There are testimonies of women choosing the work for the relative flexibility it gave compared to factory labour. There are also stories of coercion exploitation and cycles of poverty that push them into it. The historical record leaves room for debate over these experiences, but watching the wary posture of several women at the curb, you can feel danger hovering like a second shadow. A surprisingly peculiar habit, noted in passing by one Victorian commentator, catches your attention near a public house. Some women carried small tins of strong-smelling salve, not for beauty, but to mask the odour of alcohol or sweat on clients. A quick smear beneath the nose turned overwhelming encounters into something they could endure without flinching. It is a strange toolbox for emotional distance, but tools nonetheless. Away from the street you drift into a household where a married woman sits at a table with a small pile of coins. Her husband, asleep in a chair, has earned the wages, but it is her job to stretch them. She counts silently, pushes aside the amount needed for rent, then folds the few remaining pennies into a handkerchief that will sit deep in her apron pocket. Surviving accounts leave no doubt that many women served as de facto financial managers, even when the law denied them property rights. Her choices decide whether the family eats well tomorrow or goes to bed hungry. Evidence invites more than one plausible scholarly reading of how this constant mental labour shaped emotional lives. Some researchers describe women as the emotional stabilizers of the home, bearing stress quietly to protect children and husbands. Others argue that the strain produced simmering anger, exhaustion, and despair that often went unrecorded. As you listen to the woman sigh, her shoulders slumping in the candlelight, you suspect reality drifted from one state to the other, depending on the week. Behind this household in a cramped back room, you meet a girl no older than 14, nursing her infant brother, while her mother scrubs the floor. Childhood here dissolves early. Girls inherit responsibility long before they are fully grown. The weight of this early maturity presses forward in their posture, in their careful movements. They speak softly, watching the adults learning what not to say. Before you leave this section of the city, you stand in an alley where several women gather after finishing their chores. They exchange news about cheap bread, about who is ill, about which landlord raised rents again. It is a loose, improvised safety net. Not enough to catch everyone, but enough to lighten a burden for a few minutes at a time. As night closes in, you carry the realization that women's labour in Victorian London is not a footnote. It is the invisible machinery that keeps households breathing. Every wash line, every seam, every quiet calculation of coins under candlelight is part of a system that looks orderly from far away, but strains the people inside it. You turn a corner, where the street suddenly feels younger, noisier and sharper around the edges. Victorian London may be an adult's world in official documents, but on the ground you quickly realise that children shape the rhythm of the city as much as carts, markets and chimneys. They slip between legs, dart across traffic, and occupy the cracks where grown-ups are too tired or too busy to stand guard. You walk a little slower, letting the smaller figures come into focus. The first child you meet is balancing on the rim of a curb, his arms stretched like wings as he tests how far he can lean without tumbling. His jacket is too thin and too short, but his grin is fierce. His mother calls to him from a window where laundry flaps like tired flags. She does not threaten punishment. She simply reminds him to hurry to the market before the cheapest vegetables are gone. In families like theirs, errands begin young. A well-established aspect of Victorian daily life was the presence of working children in almost every district. Boys sold matches, newspapers, flowers, and cheap toys. Girls minded babies, carried water, swept doorsteps, or stitched small items for a few coins. That reality sits awkwardly beside modern romantic images of childhood. When you walk behind a boy no older than 9 pushing a heavy barrow of firewood, the discomfort grows into something you feel in your chest. His boots scrape with each step. He does not complain. He has no energy to spare. Some children move through the city with the confidence of small adults. You watch 2 sisters guiding a toddler sibling across a busy lane, their hands clasped around his wrists, their gaze alert for horses that pay no attention to small bodies. A team effort, a habit. Their parents may be at work. Their job is to keep the household's youngest member alive until dusk. Experts remain divided on how much time Victorian children actually spent playing. Some diaries from wealthier families describe long afternoons of games, outings, and reading. But evidence from working-class districts shows a harsher pattern where play clings to the edges of labour. A quick chase between deliveries, a hopscotch drawn on a step between chores. You see this truth clearly when a group of boys kick a rag ball in an alley until a shopkeeper shouts, sending them scattering. They do not stop playing, they simply shift to a doorway further down. On a narrow street in the East End, you meet a girl of perhaps 11 who carries herself like someone twice her age. She adjusts her brother's coat, wipes his nose with the edge of her sleeve, then leads him toward a small workshop where she helps with gluing paper bags. The pay is negligible, but a few pennies can mean dinner. When she glances at you, her eyes hold both childhood curiosity and an adult's guarded caution. A curious snippet of everyday behaviour you rarely hear about appears near a row of tiny shops. Some children collect cigar stubs from the pavement, drying them at home, and selling them as cheap smoking scraps. Others gather bits of coal dropped from delivery carts, wrapping them in cloth bundles to carry to parents. These are the city's smallest scavengers, turning the debris of adult life into fuel and income. They know which corners produce the best finds, and which shopkeepers will chase them away. Interpretations among specialists remain far from unified when examining how dangerous London truly was for unsupervised children. Some highlight high accident rates and the lack of safety measures on streets swarming with horses and carts. Others argue that children developed impressive situational awareness, learning survival instincts earlier than modern observers expect. Standing near an intersection, you watch a group of boys slip through moving traffic with uncanny precision, their timing almost artistic. You wince, they do not. They have been doing this since they could walk. You drift next into a schoolroom, one of the increasing number of institutions supported by churches or charities. The room is cramped. Wooden desks are carved with initials. A teacher taps a long stick on a slate board as dozens of children recite letters in unison. The reforms of the later 19th century introduced schooling for many who previously had none, but attendance is often irregular. Some children vanish for weeks when their families need them to work. Others come hungry and doze through lessons. The teacher pretends not to notice when a girl sways from fatigue. Documents from charitable organisations reveal complicated attitudes toward working children. Some reformers viewed them as victims needing rescue from harsh labour. Others saw them as potential delinquents whose idleness might corrupt society. The truth, as always, appears somewhere in between. You see it in the eyes of a barefoot boy leaning against a lamppost flipping a coin he earned by carrying a gentleman's parcel. He carries pride, but also the faint tremor of someone who knows tomorrow's luck could run thin. You follow another thread of childhood into the back courts, where families crowd around common yards. Here you hear a laughter that feels older than the children producing it. A girl jumps rope while singing a rhyme about landlords and rotten fish. A boy draws chalk figures on a brick wall, giving each character a story of mischief and escape. Play becomes a kind of rebellion, a way to soften the sharpness of a life that asks too much of them too soon. Some researchers question the extent to which children internalize the moral expectations adults placed on them. Victorian society often preached obedience, piety, and hard work, yet the streets produced their own code. Children formed alliances, defended favourite hiding spots, and created informal rules for borrowing and trading. The historical record allows multiple interpretations, but you witness a kind of street-level ethics when a ragged child shares a piece of stale bread with another who looks worse off. No sermon required. As the afternoon deepens, you walk into a small lodging house where several families rent single rooms. Inside, an infant cries while a girl of 12 bounces him rhythmically on her knee. Her mother scrubs laundry in a corner. Her father will not return until late. She performs childcare not as babysitting but as duty, necessity, survival. Surviving accounts leave no doubt that girls often became second mothers long before adulthood. Their shoulders slope with the weight of expectations they never chose. A slightly whimsical detail resurfaces when you see how some children entertain themselves with discarded theatre posters. They tear out faces, paste them onto wooden scraps, and create small puppets. Late at night, while adults collapse into bed, they perform shows for each other behind barrels or under stairwells, telling stories of kings, robbers, ghosts, and magical horses. Childhood persists here, but it must squeeze itself into corners. Researchers analysing this topic often reach conflicting conclusions regarding emotional resilience. Some believe early responsibility produced stronger, more adaptable adults. Others argue that constant pressure left deep scars, particularly in those who endured hunger or violence. Watching a boy cradle his little sister, when she stumbles, you sense both possibilities breathing in the same moment. Strength and vulnerability are not opposites here. They grow in the same soil. As twilight settles, the city becomes more perilous for small bodies. You see children lingering near shop fronts, waiting for leftover scraps, and others racing home before their parents return. A match girl hurries past with a bundle under her arm, her face pinched with worry. A chimney sweep brushes soot from his hair while coughing into a rag. Childhood here is not one picture, but 100 overlapping ones. Before you move on, you pause in a square where children for once have room to run. A ragged football made of stitched cloth arcs through the air, and shouts rise with surprising joy. For a moment, the whole city seems to exhale. Then a constable approaches, and the children scatter like startled birds. You walk away with the understanding that Victorian childhood is not the soft pastel image some nostalgic histories suggest. It is sharp, crowded, improvisational, full of quick laughter and quicker fear. A world where play, danger, hope, and hunger share the same narrow streets. You head deeper into the city, where lights grow softer and curtains hang heavier, and you begin to sense another layer of Victorian London that rarely appears in public lectures or tidy museum displays. Respectable bedrooms, viewed from the outside, look like little havens of order and decency, but once you slip inside, you find a world shaped by whispered negotiations, unspoken longings, and improvised solutions to very human needs. You step into a middle-class home where a married couple prepares for bed. The room is tidy with a small fireplace, a washstand, and a heavy wooden wardrobe. But beneath the surface calm you notice undercurrents that polite society did not name aloud. One firmly attested feature of the era was the ideal of marital purity, a moral script that encouraged spouses to behave with restraint and propriety. Yet private letters, diaries, and medical advice manuals hint at a far more complex landscape of desire, hesitation, and silent compromise. She rests on the bed's edge, brushing her hair. He adjusts the lamp wick. Their conversation stays light, almost formal, even after years of living together. Victorian households often expected emotional reserve, and some couples never fully shed that posture, even behind closed doors. But there is tenderness too, tucked into careful gestures. He sets her shawl aside. She smooths the blanket in a familiar arc. These tiny motions speak volumes about what cannot be openly discussed. Academic voices diverge on the issue of how affectionate Victorian marriages truly were. Some scholars argue that romance grew stronger, behind the scenes nurtured within the privacy that homes attempted to protect. Others suggest that emotional distance and strict social roles shaped relationships more heavily than later nostalgia admits. Watching this couple, you sense that both interpretations hold pieces of truth. Their affection is real, but so is the tension of living under constant moral scrutiny. Across town, in a cramped lodging house, you climb a staircase so narrow you must turn sideways to pass. Behind one door lies a different version of Victorian intimacy. A young, unmarried couple shares a tiny room, their belongings mingling on a single chair. They cannot afford to marry yet, but they also cannot bear the loneliness of separate lodgings. They whisper about neighbours who might report them landlords, who might evict them churches that might shame them. Documents from the era make it clear that such arrangements existed even if official statistics pretend they did not. A slightly eccentric practice preserved in a few scattered anecdotes surfaces when you glance at the small shelf above their bed. Some couples kept special cushions embroidered with discrete patterns meant to signal whether they wished to be left undisturbed by shared household members. In multi-family lodgings, these tiny codes acted as barriers where walls could not. Not every symbol worked, of course, and sometimes a cough or a sudden knock shattered the illusion of privacy. But it was a gesture toward boundaries in a world with very few. Nearby, a mother puts her children to sleep in a single bed before blowing out the candle. Once their breathing deepens, she quietly pushes the truckle bed toward the wall, giving herself and her husband at least the suggestion of separation. Interpretations among specialists remain far from unified on how couples managed intimacy in these circumstances. Some emphasize ingenuity and affection, others stress frustration and emotional strain. When you stand in the dim room, listening to her husband's tired boots scrape the floor, you feel how delicate the balancing act must have been. You wander next into a wealthier townhouse, where an older woman prepares for bed alone. Her husband sleeps in a separate room, a common arrangement in some upper-class homes. Records show that separate bedrooms were not always signs of coldness. They often reflected health concerns, snoring, or the simple desire for personal space in a culture that prized calm routines. Yet behind her composed face, you sense loneliness, softened only by the ritual of brushing her hair 30 strokes each night. She keeps a small locked drawer in her dressing table, a curious piece of personal practice, mentioned quietly in a few Victorian diaries, appears here. Sentimental mementos, pressed flowers, old love notes, scraps of ribbons from early courtship that she cannot bear to discard. Victorian morality may seem rigid from afar, but private hearts often refuse to follow the rules with such discipline. You move again, this time into a physician's consulting room, where a married couple speaks in cautious tones about matters too delicate for social conversation. Victorian medical texts reveal an array of suggested methods for managing marital relations, some practical, some misguided, and some bordering on the absurd. Advice ranged from sleep schedules to dietary changes to strange contraptions meant to promote or prevent pregnancy. These ideas floated through households like secret maps adjusted in creative ways when official answers proved useless. Some researchers question the extent to which these medical prescriptions shaped actual practice. Letters suggest that many couples simply did what felt workable, ignoring advice that was too rigid or too embarrassing. The evidence invites more than one plausible scholarly reading, but as you listen to the couple describe their concerns with lowered voices, you sense that practical intuition often mattered more than Victorian theory. A well-worn housemaid slips past you in the hallway, her eyes downcast. She knows that her presence in respectable bedrooms comes with its own hazards. Rumours of unwanted advances Whispered scandals or secret relationships appear in scattered court records and personal testimonies. She moves carefully, folding sheets, adjusting lamps and retreating quickly before drawing too much attention. Her world intersects with intimacy, but she is expected to pretend she does not notice any of it. Near midnight, you find yourself in a street where shuttered windows glow faintly from within. You hear murmurs, laughter, and the soft thump of footsteps along stairs. Behind every curtain there is a version of Victorian desire at work, some tender, some strained, some weary, all of them grounded in real bodies navigating real limitations. For all its strict moral codes, the city hums with private negotiations. Couples carve out closeness in cramped rooms. Lovers meet in secret. Married pairs share affection, carefully balancing personal needs with social expectations. People improvise. They adapt. They bend rules quietly, not to be rebellious, but simply to live. As you leave these dimly lit rooms behind you, carry the understanding that Victorian respectability was never as airtight as textbooks imply. Bedrooms were filled with longing, awkwardness, affection, and uncertainty. And beneath the prim exterior of the era, you find the same soft edges, the same quiet hopes, the same fragile intimacies that shape human life, everywhere. You drift toward a street where the lamps burn lower and the voices thicken, not with danger, but with the soft heaviness of people looking for ways to soothe the rough edges of their days. Victorian London is full of hard work and harder disappointments, and you soon realise that drinking and self-medication are not side notes here. They are woven into the city's pulse-shaping evenings, tempers, sleep, and sometimes entire lifetimes. The first doorway you pass leads into a public house, where the floorboards creak under muddy boots. Men stand shoulder to shoulder, talking in low bursts, their breath clouding the air with beer and tobacco. Women gather at smaller tables along the back wall, tending infants or simply claiming a rare moment off their feet. One consistently recorded reality of the period was the sheer number of pubs and gin shops crammed into working-class districts. In some neighbourhoods, you could walk less than a minute between one drinking room and the next. You step inside far enough to feel the warmth, that heavy stew of heat, yeast-damp wool, and smoke. A man at the bar taps his empty glass, not loudly, just with the weary confidence of someone who has done it 1,000 times. Another counts out coins with careful motions, deciding whether to risk one more pint. A third stares into the middle distance, as though he left a part of himself at work and is trying to coax it back. Outside again, you follow the trail of faint perfume and rustling skirts to a smaller shop selling patent medicines. The shelves gleam with bottles labelled as cures for everything, from sleeplessness to nervous complaints to female troubles. Surviving reports repeatedly make clear that many of these concoctions contained alcohol opium laudanum or cocaine derivatives, all wrapped in bright promises and flowery prose. They were legal, accessible, and widely used, especially by women whose burdens were rarely acknowledged in public. You watch a young mother buy a small bottle she calls her night mixture. The shopkeeper wraps it neatly, pretending not to see the strain around her eyes. Academic interpretations remain unsettled regarding how widely laudanum circulated among ordinary households. Some scholars argue it was everywhere. Others suggest use concentrated in certain trades or districts. The truth drifting between these views becomes obvious when you follow the woman home and see her tuck the bottle beside a chipped teacup. For her, it is not luxury, it is survival. Children too encounter these remedies. A lightly peculiar detail preserved in memoirs reveals that some mothers rubbed small amounts of soothing syrup onto infants' gums, hoping to calm teething pain or restlessness during long nights. Many of those syrups contained opiates. You watch a baby's eyes grow heavy after a tiny dose, and although the room quiets, you feel a ripple of unease. Victorian parenting carried its own shadows, shaped by exhaustion, limited medical knowledge, and desperate practicality. As you continue walking, you pass an older man leaning on a lamppost, swaying gently. He mutters to himself, then chuckles as though someone just told him a private joke. A constable approaches, scanning him with a mixture of annoyance and pity. There is ongoing debate in the field about whether Victorian policing treated drunkenness primarily as a moral failure or a public order problem. Some historians argue constables were harsh, arresting men freely. Others insist enforcement varied widely, shaped by the officer's mood and the neighbourhood's reputation. Tonight the constable simply guides the man toward home, giving him a soft warning. Night deepens and the streets shift. You begin to notice how different groups seek different comforts. Dock workers gather around barrels outside taverns, catching warmth from the embers while sipping cheap gin. Seamstresses linger near cookshops that sell hot tea, sometimes fortified with a secret splash of something stronger. A middle-aged woman slips into a quiet alley, uncorking a tiny bottle of valerian tincture. You smell its bitter, earthy scent before she caps it and hides it again. Contemporary writings leave strong evidence that Victorians treated self-medication as part of ordinary life, not as a last resort. Pills, tonics, powders, and cordials travelled easily through households. Some soothed real pain. Others numbed emotions that society refused to name. A man who never cried might drink quietly until his grief softened at the edges. A woman who was expected to endure constant labour might lean on laudanum to shrink the world long enough to breathe. Researchers examining the evidence arrive at varying conclusions about how harmful these habits truly were. Some point to widespread addiction, citing diaries filled with apologies and withdrawal notes. Others argue that many users managed their doses carefully and suffered few lasting consequences. You walk beside a shop assistant who pours a bit of tonic into her tea each night. Her hands tremble without it. Her face relaxes with it. She insists she's fine. You can feel how fragile that word is. A curious household trick people once relied on was the mixing of beer with milk for children, or the elderly who struggled to sleep or eat. It sounds strange to modern ears, but for families without access to reliable medicine, such mixtures were simply another tool. Watching a grandmother stir the pale, frothy drink while whispering a lullaby gives the practice an oddly tender air. Even wealthier homes are not immune. You enter a townhouse where a gentleman sits by the fire, swirling a glass of brandy he calls his nerve tonic. He claims it sharpens his wits. The faint tremor in his fingers suggests otherwise. His wife, meanwhile, sips a cordial that contains more than a trace of laudanum. Her smile is smooth and distant, as though someone has turned down the volume on her worries. As you move on, a group of young apprentices slip out of a tavern, laughing too loudly, trying to look older than they are. Music spills after them, a fiddle weaving through footsteps and shouts. You feel how alcohol becomes not just a numbing agent, but a temporary escape from the rigid hierarchies of work. For a few hours, everyone's shoulders lift. Tomorrow will bring the reckoning. Tonight brings relief. Modern scholarship offers no single tidy consensus on whether these habits made Victorian life more bearable or more dangerous. Evidence points in both directions, sometimes in the same household. You feel this contradiction when a woman steadies her husband as he climbs the stairs, whispering patience, even as her own eyes look dulled by the tonic she swears she barely touches. Before leaving this district, you notice the city's quietest symptom of all this numbing. The streets do not fully sleep. A soft hum of restless bodies, muffled arguments, and late-night footsteps carries through the alleys. London, soaked in drink smoke and makeshift cures, drifts into an uneven slumber that feels more like a pause between troubles than true rest. You walk onward, sensing that hunger now waits just around the next corner, shaping lives as powerfully as drink ever could. You follow the scent of frying fat down a narrow lane, and London suddenly feels hungrier. Victorian appetites do not unfold around polished dining tables and silver cutlery for most people. Hunger is a constant companion, a quiet pressure that shapes decisions from morning to night. When you walk past shop fronts glowing with roasted meats and heaps of pastries, you feel how cruel a contrast this is for the thousands who pass by with empty pockets. A food stall near the corner offers a cheap plate of potatoes swimming in thin gravy. A girl of maybe 14 counts her coins twice before handing them over. She eats standing up, swallowing quickly, eyes scanning the crowd for work rather than savour. One widely acknowledged feature of Victorian life involved meals that were more about fuel than pleasure. Bread dripping weak tea-boiled potatoes and an occasional scrap of meat form the backbone of many diets. You continue into a crowded market where vendors shout prices that rise and fall with the weather, shipping delays, or simple luck. Fishmongers scrape their boards clean, revealing the sharp tang of salt and scales, while vegetable sellers sort through piles for produce that will survive another hour. Surviving reports repeatedly make clear that markets were full of adulterated goods. Chalk mixed into flour, water pumped into milk, alum added to bread to make it look whiter. Customers tried to judge freshness with their eyes and noses, but even the careful ones were fooled. Near a stall selling boiled eels, you overhear two workers debating where to find the cheapest dinner. One mentions a cook shop where yesterday's leftovers are reheated into pies. Another describes a cellar tavern where you can get hot stew thickened with whatever scraps the owner managed to gather. Researchers continue to puzzle over the question of how nutritious these meals truly were. Some argue that even the cheap dishes provided enough calories for grueling labour. Others point out the near absence of vitamins and fresh vegetables. The truth likely varied from street to street, from household to household. A lightly odd custom surfaces near a butcher's stall. An offbeat routine occasionally mentioned by observers involved families buying penny portions, tiny cuts of meat, normally trimmed away, sold to the very poor. These odd scraps simmered into stews that were more bone than flesh. You watch a woman pick through a tray of gristle and cartilage, choosing the pieces that might release flavour if cooked long enough. She bundles them into a cloth with a determination that feels heavier than the food itself. The further you go, the more you recognise a pattern. Well-fed households live near broad avenues, where bakeries display warm loaves stacked in pyramids. Poorer families cluster around side streets, where food is sold in damp corners under flickering lamps. You see a man sniffing milk before buying a cup. You see a child pressing a finger into a bread roll to judge its weight. Food buying here is not a casual errand. It is strategy. It is vigilance. Interpretations fragment sharply among experts on this point when it comes to the emotional impact of this constant watchfulness. Some claim families adapted, turning frugality into a kind of sturdy pride. Others argue that unending caution eroded joy, making every meal a calculation rather than comfort. When you watch a mother set aside half her portion so her children can eat more, you sense how emotional the issue truly is. The smell of roasting chestnuts leads you to a street performer who sells nuts from a metal drum. The warmth is inviting. A small boy clutches a single chestnut his mother bought to keep him quiet while she waits outside a pawn shop. He turns it over in his hands, inhaling the sweet aroma before taking tiny bites to make it last. Contemporary writings leave strong evidence that treats were rare luxuries for working families. A single sweet or roasted nut might be stretched across an entire afternoon. You stop near a doorway where a man sits on a step eating bread, softened with broth poured from a chipped mug. His clothes hint at steady but low-paid work. He tells a friend that dinner will be simple tonight, maybe just bread dipped again in whatever broth is left. Some historians remain unsure to what extent malnutrition shaped the health of labourers. Certain medical records imply widespread undernourishment. Other sources show men performing astonishing amounts of physical labour despite poor diets. The contradiction hangs in the air like steam from a kettle. Inside, a small cookshop steam blurs the windows. Patrons hunch over narrow tables, spoons clinking against metal bowls. A curious household trick people once relied on was stretching soup with mashed turnips to mimic the texture of richer stews. You watch as a cook ladles out a bowl that smells stronger than it tastes. A man finishes it, in minutes wipes his mouth with his sleeve, and returns to work. Even in wealthier districts, food tells stories. In a townhouse kitchen, servants peel oranges shipped from warmer climates. The smell is bright and elegant, so different from the earthy scents of root vegetables in the East End. The contrast is so stark it feels like two separate cities have been stitched together. Upstairs, the family eats roast beef oysters and buttered vegetables. Downstairs, the staff share leftovers that barely resemble the meal above. Researchers examining the evidence arrive at varying conclusions about how often the classes overlapped in food markets. Some argue that the poor occasionally accessed luxuries on feast days or through leftover scraps. Others insist the barrier was nearly absolute. You try to imagine the girl from the eel stall walking into a West End bakery. You struggle to see her stepping through the door without shrinking into herself. The social divide in food is not just economic, it is emotional and spatial. Near the river you find a woman boiling cabbage in a pot, blackened with soot. The smell is sharp enough to sting your eyes. She stirs quietly, adding a single carrot for sweetness. Children gather around her, waiting with hopeful faces. The pot simmers, filling the room with a thin warmth that seems less like sustenance and more like determination in liquid form. Before you move on, you encounter a man selling pies from a tray, the crusts glossy with an unknown fat. Rumour has it such pies sometimes contained questionable meat. You watch people buy them anyway. Hunger is persuasive. It rarely waits for certainty. As you continue toward the darker streets ahead, you feel hunger trailing behind you, like a soft, persistent shadow. Victorian London may bustle with markets, cookshops and taverns, but for countless families, every meal floats somewhere between scarcity and hope. And tomorrow's breakfast is never fully guaranteed. You move toward the river, where the air thickens, not with the comfort of cooking fumes or warm pub breath, but with something heavier and more persistent. Victorian London does not let you forget that every inhale carries a story, and many of those stories involve soot smoke and sickness drifting together in the same grey haze. Breathing here is not a simple act. It is a negotiation. The first gust that hits your face carries a mix of coal smoke, damp fog, and the unmistakable sourness of refuse rotting somewhere nearby. A barge on the Thames unloads coal by the ton, each shovelful, releasing a dark cloud that settles onto the water like spilled ink. Porters cough into their sleeves. Passers-by quicken their pace as if distance alone can protect their lungs. One consistently recorded reality of the era was that coal powered nearly everything. Heat industry, transport, lighting. The city rose and fell on it, and Londoners paid for its conveniences with every breath. You walk toward a narrow lane where houses lean inward as though whispering secrets. Laundry hangs stiff in the cold air, already dusted with soot from a factory chimney only streets away. Women beat rugs with quick, angry motions, and within minutes the dust settles back down as though mocking their efforts. Surviving reports repeatedly make clear that smog was not an occasional nuisance. It was a season, a presence sometimes so heavy that people lit lamps at midday and stumbled down familiar streets as if navigating a dream. Near a water pump, you hear a woman warn her children not to drink too deeply. Researchers continue to puzzle over the question of how pollution interacted with disease outbreaks. Some argue that the infamous fogs trapped dangerous microbes and worsened infections. Others believe the connection was more indirect, with weakened lungs making people more vulnerable. The evidence is uneven, and you can feel the uncertainty lingering like mist at your ankles. You turn a corner and find an elderly man sitting on a stool outside his shop wrapped in a shawl, despite the mild temperature. He coughs with a deep wet rasp that seems carved into his ribs. Contemporary writings leave strong evidence that chronic respiratory issues affected people across classes. The wealthy suffered from smoky fireplaces and city air. The poor endured factories' damp basements and mouldy rooms where windows barely opened. Breathlessness did not discriminate. It simply visited more often where the air was worst. Inside a tenement, you meet a woman boiling water for washing. Steam fills the room, mingling with soot particles that drift from the fireplace. An offbeat routine, occasionally mentioned by observers, involved hanging damp cloths over doors and windows in an attempt to trap dust. You see one now sagging from a nail grey with weeks of gathered grime. She replaces it every few days, calling it her fog catcher. It is both clever and heartbreaking. Interpretations fragment sharply among experts on this point when assessing how much the famous London fog was natural versus man-made. Some stress meteorological quirks of the Thames Basin. Others emphasise the role of coal industrial fumes and household fires. Watching the way smoke curls upward and blends seamlessly with the mist, you realise the fog is not a single thing. It is a marriage of nature and necessity, inseparable once combined. You step into a small factory courtyard where workers take a break. A girl, her apron streaked with dye, coughs sharply into a rag. A boy rubs his eyes, blinking away irritation from fumes that have seeped into his hair and clothes. One widely acknowledged feature of Victorian industry involved chemical vapours that irritated lungs, skin and eyes. Workers often developed chronic coughs or wheezing, yet most simply endured because breathlessness did not exempt anyone from needing wages. Down by the river, the tide brings with it a scent that is equal parts mud, sewage and industrial runoff. A barge unloads hides from a tannery. The smell is so powerful, you almost step back. Some historians remain unsure to what extent river pollution contributed to everyday illness. The surviving evidence suggests a complicated picture. Some families lived long lives near the Thames, others succumbed to infections that may have been worsened by contaminated water and damp air. The fog hides as many answers as it reveals. You watch a group of children skipping near a drain where murky water glistens. They jump over rivulets of strange colours trickling from a nearby dye works. Their laughter feels both resilient and fragile. No one tells them to move away. Perhaps everyone has grown too accustomed to the hazards to notice. A curious household trick people once relied on was burning vinegar or tar in small pots to purify the air. You see a widow lighting one now, waving her hand gently above the pot as if directing the fumes toward imaginary illness. The scent is sharp, almost medicinal. She swears it helps her sleep when the fog grows thick enough to creep under her door. Modern scholarship offers no single tidy consensus on how air quality shaped mortality. Some records point to spikes in deaths during severe smog. Others show that families adapted building resilience over generations. What you feel standing in this heavy air is neither statistic nor argument. It is the weight of 1,000 small struggles for breath. As night gathers, the smog thickens, wrapped around lamplight like a damp blanket. Sounds dull. Steps echo strangely. A man stumbles disoriented. A horse snorts, shaking its head, as though trying to clear the air. You walk slowly, sensing how the city's atmosphere presses inward, softening distance, amplifying discomfort. And then you see her, a young woman, airing a mattress by holding it halfway out a window. She slaps it rhythmically, sending little clouds of dust drifting into the street. It is a losing battle, but she fights it anyway. London demands it. Everything here breathes the city, whether it wants to or not. As you leave the district, your chest feels tight. Victorian London is not just loud or crowded, it is heavy. You carry this weight with you, knowing that disease lurks where the air thickens, waiting for the right moment to settle into a body already tired from cold and hunger. You move toward a row of narrow alleys where the city's politeness thins and its practical instincts take over. Victorian London liked to present itself as a well-governed metropolis, a place where laws and moral order guided everyday life. But once you slip into the smaller passages, you find a far messier truth. Here petty cheats, quiet scams, and whispered favours shape survival just as much as honest labour. This is not the dramatic crime of penny dreadfuls. This is the everyday negotiation between need opportunity and the watchful eyes of neighbours. A repeatedly attested pattern in Victorian records shows that petty crime flourished where wages faltered. When food or rent came up short, people adjusted their moral boundaries in small pragmatic ways. A butcher shaved weights from his scales. A baker lightened his loaves. A costermonger sold bruised fruit as fresh. None of this looks like villainy to the people doing it. It looks like Wednesday. You watch a woman haggling over a basket of apples. She presses them with practiced fingers, turning each one as if reading a secret code. The seller smiles too readily. The apples are past their prime. She knows this. He knows she knows. Still they settle on a price. Life proceeds. The more you observe, the more you realise that honesty in Victorian London often came in practical shades rather than clear lines. A boy passes you carrying a pocketful of nails. He sells them door to door. Some are bent, some stolen, some entirely legitimate. He mixes them together in a single bag, betting that most customers will not look too closely. An unexpectedly whimsical scrap of practice from the era shows that children sometimes sharpen their own sense of enterprise by selling whatever small objects they could scavenge. Lost buttons, broken toys, stray ribbons. They turned found debris into a form of currency. Near a tavern, you overhear a pair of dock workers discussing a consignment of coal that arrives slightly lighter than expected. They laugh knowingly. Somewhere along the journey, a few shovelfuls must have fallen off the cart. Contemporary documentation consistently indicates that pilfering from warehouses, docks, and delivery wagons was widespread, often carried out in tiny amounts that no one pursued individually. The system absorbed the losses. The people absorbed the risk. Historians continue to contest how fully such microcrimes shaped the city's economy. Some argue they barely dented overall trade. Others believe they formed a significant hidden economy that propped up fragile households. Watching the quiet exchange of goods and coins at a darkened doorway, you feel the uncertainty between these interpretations. What looks small from above often feels enormous to the people living it. You wander deeper into an alley where a man offers shoe repairs. His tools are worn, his sign crooked, but he greets you warmly. When a woman approaches with a torn boot, he examines it carefully. Then, with a conspiratorial smile, he offers to mend it quickly, for a fraction of the usual cost. In return, she slips him a small favour information about an employer seeking temporary work. These exchanges form the city's quieter circulatory system, moving opportunity through back channels that official institutions cannot track. A faintly surprising domestic habit recorded in accounts was that some households kept rainy day boxes filled not with coins, but with objects that could be traded informally. Pins, scraps of lace, old tools, bits of string, chunks of soap. Items you might dismiss become valuable when money runs thin. You spot one such box in a lodging house kitchen. Its contents look random, but to the family who keeps it, every item is a potential bargaining chip. Specialists interpreting this material diverge in noticeable ways when describing why petty cheating was so common, yet rarely condemned by neighbours. Some point to communal ethics built around mutual tolerance. Others argue that fear of conflict kept people silent. As you listen to two women whisper about a shopkeeper's habit of watering milk, you sense there is no single answer. Judgment here is fluid. Survival recalibrates morals daily. In a small yard behind a row of shops, you meet a man stirring a pot of glue used for binding boxes. He works long hours, and still his wages come up short. On the side, he sells leftover scraps of cardboard, wrapped neatly, with string to children who use them for play or trade. He calls it recycling. His employer would call it theft, but you see the pride in his face when a little girl pays him a penny and beams. You step into a pawn shop glowing with lamplight. Shelves brim with watches, shawls, candlesticks, boots all traded temporarily or permanently in desperate moments. The pawnbroker moves quietly, his voice low, his eyes sharp. He does not cheat outright, but he rounds down values with gentle precision. People accept his numbers because arguing risks losing the transaction entirely. The pawn shop is a lifeline, but one that always takes a toll. Near the street corner, you witness a subtle dance between a baker and a long-time customer. She cannot pay full price today. He pretends not to notice the missing coin and adjusts his scale slightly to compensate. Tomorrow, perhaps, she will return the favour by helping his wife with washing. These are the invisible threads that keep the city from unravelling. No law regulates them. No ledger records them. They exist in nods, glances, and the fragile promise of future balance. Researchers have yet to reach agreement on whether such small cheats should be considered crime adaptation or mutual aid. The lines blur constantly. A woman padding bread dough to stretch it for her family harms no one. A vendor adding chalk to flour harms many. Yet both actions grow from the same soil of scarcity. The evidence encourages several rival explanations, none fully satisfying on their own. By late evening, the streets hum with the soft shuffle of nighttime survival. A man pretends to drop a coin watches, who picks it up and judges their honesty by whether they return it. A shopgirl rounds up the price of a purchase to pocket a sliver for herself. A bootblack adds a splash of water to his polished tin to make it last longer. These are not grand scandals. They are coping mechanisms. As you return to the main road, you realise Victorian London is less about strict lines of legal and illegal behaviour and more about constant improvisation. People bend rules because the rules do not bend for them. They cheat a little trust selectively and rely on quiet exchanges to stay afloat. By the time you leave the alleyways behind, you understand that the undercurrent of petty deception is not darkness for darkness's sake. It is a language of survival spoken softly in doorways, on cobblestones, and behind shop counters, shaping the rhythm of the city one improvised bargain at a time. You step into a wider street where the shadows stretch long and the lamps flicker unevenly, and suddenly you sense a different kind of pressure in the air. Victorian London does not need modern surveillance cameras to make people feel watched. It has constables who stroll with deliberate slowness, landlords who note every late return neighbours, who hear more than they admit, and informers who trade whispers for favours. The city behaves like a giant listening device, tuned to catch anything unusual. The first figure you notice is a policeman standing near a corner, tapping his truncheon lightly against his boot. His steady posture suggests calm authority, yet every person who passes him alters their movements slightly. Shoulders stiffen, footsteps quicken. A repeatedly attested pattern in Victorian records shows that police presence influenced behaviour simply by existing. Even people doing nothing wrong performed modest versions of innocence as they approached a constable. You find yourself doing the same. The officer glances at you, then turns his attention to a group of boys chasing one another across the street. He does not intervene, but his gaze is enough to scatter them. Children know instinctively which adults have the power to drag them home or into a station. A woman selling flowers rearranges her stall as soon as the constable walks away. She opens a small drawer beneath her table and counts the coins she kept hidden. Contemporary documentation consistently indicates that many street sellers concealed part of their income to fend off both theft and fines. She moves with practiced ease, knowing the city can take from her in multiple ways if she's not cautious. Experts remain split on the degree to which Victorian policing emphasised prevention versus punishment. Some scholars argue constables played largely symbolic roles, patrolling streets to reassure citizens. Others emphasise the constable's authority to arrest for vague offences such as loitering or disorderly conduct. Watching how people adjust their posture when a uniform enters view, you feel the mixed truth in both interpretations. Fear and reassurance arrive together. In a nearby alley, you catch sight of a man leaning close to a constable, whispering something you cannot hear. The officer nods slowly, then casually continues his patrol. One oddly charming detail lingering in period notes reveals that police often relied on unofficial informers, people who exchanged snippets of gossip for leniency or protection. These informers drifted between communities carrying news like drifting leaves. Some were paid, many were not. Their loyalties shifted like the weather. At a doorway, a landlord watches tenants come and go with a careful eye. Victorian landlords often played gatekeepers of behaviour, deciding who could stay, who must leave, and whose quiet troubles they were willing to tolerate. When a man stumbles slightly from fatigue, the landlord's frown deepens. He notes the movement, perhaps storing it away for a later conversation about rent. Eyewitness accounts from the time frequently confirm that tenants lived with the constant knowledge that their home could be taken from them with little warning. Inside a cramped lodging house, you see the subtler form of surveillance practiced by neighbours. A woman pauses mid-conversation to listen for footsteps in the hallway. A man hushes his friend when he hears boards creak upstairs. In a building where walls are thin and secrets thinner, everyone learns to speak in codes. Interpretive frameworks among historians pull in different directions here. Some view this neighbourly monitoring as community care. Others see it as mutual suspicion. The truth shifts from room to room. You wander into a small shop lit by a single lamp. The shopkeeper greets you kindly, but his eyes flick toward the street every time footsteps pass. He is known for keeping a little book beneath the counter where he records the names of people who owe him money, as well as those who might be useful sources of information. A faintly surprising domestic habit recorded in accounts was that many tradespeople kept similar notebooks, half ledger, half memory aid, capturing reputations as well as debts. Outside again, you follow a constable as he performs his nightly round. Every so often he pauses, listening. The city gives him cues, a raised voice, a sudden silence behind shutters, a clatter where there should be none. Researchers have yet to reach agreement on whether constables truly understood the neighbourhoods they patrolled or merely pretended to. Some suggest officers developed deep intuitive knowledge of local patterns. Others argue they remained outsiders, mistrusted and mistrusting. You walk beside him, hearing only fragments, and understand why the debate endures. Further along, you pass a group of young men clustered in a narrow court. They laugh loudly until a constable approaches, then disperse in perfectly choreographed fashion. He does not chase them. He does not have to. His mere presence redraws the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Victorian law distinguished between crime and nuisance, but on the ground, the line often blurred. What mattered was not guilt, but whether you drew the wrong eyes at the wrong time. A man in a bowler hat nods politely to the constable, then slips into a private club where the rules of surveillance change once again. Behind thick doors, merchants and clerks relax in a bubble of semi-privacy. But even here, conversations are monitored through social expectations, reputations, and class hierarchies. People know who is listening. They know which topics can be safely broached, and which must remain buried beneath polite laughter. Near midnight, you find yourself walking past a row of windows, glowing faintly behind heavy curtains. A shadow moves inside, then freezes when footsteps echo outside. Someone waits for the sound to fade before continuing whatever secret business the night requires. Modern analysis produces no fully unified conclusion about how much secrecy shaped Victorian social life, but watching these trembling silhouettes, you suspect it saturated everything, from love to money to simple rest. Before leaving the district, you notice something striking. Surveillance here is not one-directional. People watch the police as much as the police watch them. Vendors track constables' routes. Tenants observe landlords' tempers. Children memorize which alleys officers frequent. Everyone maps everyone else. London becomes a city of cautious glances and silent calculations. By the time you return to the main street, you realize that Victorian order rests less on firm laws and more on a network of constant observation. People behave not simply because they fear punishment, but because the city is always somehow paying attention. You drift toward a quieter stretch of London, where church bells echo between brick walls, their tones soft but insistent, as if reminding the city to behave. Victorian London wore religion like a formal coat one meant to be seen in public, brushed free of lint buttoned properly to the throat. Yet once you step behind the facade, you discover doubts, hypocrisies, private bargains, and wavering convictions that seldom appear in respectable sermons. Faith here is both anchor and performance, both comfort and quiet burden. You push open the door of a small mission hall where rows of benches hold neatly dressed families, labourers in patched coats, widows in shawls, and children with hair combed into stiff lines. The preacher speaks about duty, charity, and moral steadfastness. His voice warms the cold room. A clearly established characteristic of the era involved the immense influence churches wielded over social behaviour, guiding everything from personal conduct to neighbourhood expectations. For many Londoners, religion shaped reputation as much as belief. But as you study the faces around you, you sense currents running beneath the polished surface. A man in the third row nods politely at every line, yet stares at the floor as if counting worries rather than blessings. A mother clutches her son, not in reverence, but in exhaustion. A young woman leans forward when the preacher mentions forgiveness, a shadow flickering across her expression. The room is full of small stories that no sermon can fully gather. When the congregation rises to sing, a late-arriving dock worker slips into the back smelling of brine and fatigue. He sings off-key but with a quiet earnestness. Eyewitness accounts from the time frequently confirm that many Londoners treated church-going as both social obligation and emotional refuge. Some attended for faith, others attended to avoid gossip. Some came simply to warm themselves for an hour. The wooden pews held every kind of motive. Researchers have yet to reach agreement on whether Victorian London was genuinely devout or outwardly conformist. Some scholars see widespread sincere religious conviction shaping everyday choices. Others argue that many people participated out of fear of judgment rather than personal belief. You feel that tension directly when you overhear two women leaving the hall, whispering about who did not attend this week and what that absence might imply. Faith becomes intertwined with surveillance. You follow the crowd to the street where a group of children clutch small pamphlets printed with Bible verses. They wave them like trophies, a faintly surprising domestic habit recorded in accounts. Was the placement of these pamphlets under pillows for good luck or protection sometimes treated with more superstition than scripture? The line between religion and folk belief blurred often, especially in crowded neighbourhoods where spiritual comfort came in many forms. You wander next into a wealthier district where church attendance operates on a different register. Here pews are purchased or reserved, and clothing becomes part of the ritual. One delightfully obscure behaviour noted by observers described families arriving deliberately late to display their fashionable entrances, timing their appearance for maximum visibility. Prestige tangles with piety until it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. Inside one such church, you watch a woman bow her head in elegant posture. Her prayer book is finely bound, its pages gilded, but her eyes wander during the sermon. She mouths a hymn without sound. Her faith, if it exists in full, is quieter than her social role demands. Contemporary documentation consistently indicates that upper-class devotion, sometimes centered on civic respectability rather than spiritual intensity. The church provided community structure and visibility. Belief was optional, appearance was not. Meanwhile, in a poorer quarter, you slip into a small kitchen where a family gathers around a flickering candle. They do not attend church tonight. Instead, the father reads a few well-worn verses aloud, stumbling occasionally over faded print. His wife kneads dough while listening. Their children sit close drawn more by the warmth than the reading. Interpretive frameworks among historians pull in different directions about such domestic practices. Some describe them as signs of a strong household faith. Others see them as pragmatic alternatives for families unable to spare time or clothing for public worship. A subtly peculiar detail emerges when you see a talisman pinned above the hearth, a small cross made from dried rushes. Though rarely mentioned in formal church texts, such items blended Christian symbols with older lingering folk customs. Religion here is not a clean doctrinal line. It is a tapestry woven from inherited habits, practical worries, seasonal rites, and whispered family traditions. As the night cools, you drift toward a tavern overflowing with laughter. Inside, several men argue about predestination free will and whether good deeds matter more than good intentions. Their conversation is loud, half serious, half playful. Academic circles persist in debating how far Victorian men engaged with doctrinal questions, but in moments like this you see theology mixing freely with ale humour and a desire to sound clever among friends. On the walk home, you pass a young teacher removing a cross necklace from around her neck before entering her lodging house. She keeps it hidden because her landlady disapproves of her particular denomination. Tensions between religious groups simmered beneath the polite facade of unity. Catholics, Anglicans, Methodists, Unitarians, and others often viewed one another with suspicion, and the divisions seeped into workplaces, marriages, and social opportunities. As you continue, church bells ring again, echoing across the rooftops. A couple pauses mid-argument, softening at the sound. A child looks up, momentarily comforted. A shopkeeper mutters that it is too late for bells, but listens anyway. Faith here is not monolithic. It is a shifting mixture of ritual fear, longing habit, and weekly rhythm. By the time you reach the next street, you understand that Victorian religion is not the rigid pillar some histories claim. It is fluid, complicated, and intimately tied to the human heart. People cling to belief for different reasons, some for hope, some for reputation, some for comfort, some for fear, and some because it makes the city's sharp corners feel a little less harsh. You wander toward the busy commercial streets, where imported goods gleam behind shop windows, and everyday households unknowingly trace the outlines of empire with each purchase. Victorian London often imagined itself as the centre of the world, yet most people never paused to consider how much of their daily life depended on faraway lands, unfamiliar hands, and unseen costs. Empire does not announce itself here with grand statues. It whispers from teacups, clothing, furniture, and even the scents hanging in the kitchen air. The first shop you pass is a grocer's, its window crowded with bright packets of tea. A small sign boasts blends from Ceylon, Assam, and China. Well-preserved evidence from the era demonstrates that tea drinking became an anchor of British domestic life, consumed by all classes, despite originating thousands of miles away. You watch a maid hurry inside to buy a quarter-pound of the cheapest blend. She folds the packet into her apron, as though tucking away a small luxury. Next to the tea, jars of sugar sparkle like tiny crystals. The grocer praises its purity, though he does not mention the plantations where it was cut, processed and shipped. A broadly recognised feature of Victorian society was that colonial goods were normalised to the point of invisibility. People rarely asked how such sweetness reached their tables. They simply stirred it into their tea, assuming it had always belonged in London kitchens. You step into a drapery shop where fabrics from India and Egypt lie neatly stacked. A woman chooses a bolt of cotton for a new dress. Multiple period sources independently confirm that cotton production are broad-shaped British fashion trends and household textiles. Yet most Londoners thought of these fabrics only as bargains or niceties, never as threads linking them to distant landscapes and labourers. A faint but unusual behaviour described by observers shows that some families re-waxed or perfumed imported fabrics to mimic the scents of home, believing foreign cloth carried unfamiliar smells. You see a shop girl sprinkling lavender water over a stack of shawls before arranging them in the window. Her employer insists it draws customers. She smiles, though you suspect she finds the ritual strange. When you leave the shop, you pass a boy selling spices from a wooden tray. The air swirls with cinnamon, cardamom and pepper. He calls out their names proudly, though he may not know where any of them grow. Research communities remain unsettled on whether Londoners truly connected these flavours to empire or simply embraced them as part of cosmopolitan city life. Some historians argue for deep awareness, others for shallow consumption. Watching the boy, you sense he cares more about earning a penny than pondering geography. Further along, a shipment of tropical hardwood arrives at a carpenter's yard. Men unload boards in long polished slabs. Surviving civic reports strongly indicate that such woods were prized for furniture, admired for their durability and sheen. Yet their origins in colonial forests, often stripped with little regard for local communities, remained distant, abstract realities for the average Londoner. The furniture that later fills parlours carries the faint scent of empire, though nobody speaks of it. In a milliner's shop, you find hats trimmed with feathers from distant birds. Ostrich plumes shimmer in soft lamplight. A small yet surprisingly odd custom of the time was the boiling and reshaping of exotic feathers to achieve dramatic curls. You watch a milliner demonstrate the technique, her fingers deft and confident. The beauty of the final product conceals the long journey each plume has taken from savannas to docks to her quiet workshop. You move into a narrow cafe filled with the aroma of coffee beans roasted earlier that morning. Men sit reading newspapers, dipping bread into steaming cups. A man praises the richness of the blend, unaware that its path to his table crossed oceans and colonial infrastructure. Some academic voices still question whether Victorian consumers recognised the human cost behind such items, or whether the empire's enormity obscured it. Their writings disagree, and standing here in the cafe, you sense why. People taste luxury. They rarely taste politics. A seamstress nearby works with imported silk running the glossy thread through her fingers. She prides herself on the quality, though she could not point to the region where the cocoons were harvested. Debate continues over how accurately we can say that ordinary Londoners understood the scale of imperial trade. Some letters hint at curiosity, others suggest complete indifference. You suspect the question has no single answer. Awareness depended on class education and personal inclination. As you continue walking, you pass a tobacconist's shop, fragrant with blends from Virginia and the Caribbean. Men gather outside comparing flavours. Analysts studying the era reach sharply varied conclusions about how tobacco shaped London's social culture. Yet they agree on one point: the product was ubiquitous. Pipes, cigars and snuff boxes appear in bedrooms, parlours, workshops and alleys alike. Few pause to ask about the labour or land behind each pinch. You find yourself drawn toward a modest home where a family prepares supper. On the table sit tea, sugar, pepper and cloth napkins sewn from imported cotton scraps. Every element, from meal to furniture, rests on unseen global foundations. Modern historians diverge significantly in explaining this pattern. Some argue empire was ever present in daily consciousness. Others believe it remained background noise. But watching the family eat without remarking on any foreign element, you sense that empire seeped quietly into the bones of everyday routine. As night deepens, you stroll past a second-hand shop, displaying curios from abroad. Small figurines, lacquered boxes, carved trinkets. Children press their noses to the glass. One girl whispers that the objects look magical. A little domestic eccentricity, mentioned in passing, was that households sometimes placed such curios in their parlours, not as signs of imperial pride, but simply because they made for good conversation pieces. Novelty, not ideology, brought them through the door. By the time you reach the end of the street, you recognise that Victorian London was stitched together, with threads spun far beyond its borders. Empire hid inside routine purchases, everyday comforts, familiar tastes. It shaped homes quietly, subtly, persistently, influencing people who never set foot on a ship or read about distant colonies. You walk on knowing that the next district will tell a different story, one shaped not by faraway lands, but by the weather and moods of the city itself. You step into a broad street where the sky feels unusually large, and for the first time in hours you become aware of the weather as its own kind of storyteller. Victorian London is not only shaped by work hunger or class, it is shaped by the seasons, by cold that seeps under doors, by fog that swallows sound, by rain that turns alleys into rivers, and by heat that drives tempers upward like rising steam. The city has moods, and they affect everyone who walks its length, whether they admit it or not. A wind rushes through the street, pushing dust into your eyes. Multiple period sources independently confirm that Londoners talked endlessly about the weather, not as idle chatter, but because it actually dictated survival. A warm winter meant fewer deaths. A cold snap meant coal prices spiked. A late frost destroyed vegetables and raised bread costs. Weather here is not backdrop. It is an active participant in every decision. You turn down a lane where washing hangs stiff on lines stretched between buildings. A drizzle begins to fall so fine it feels like breath against your cheeks. Women dart to pull down clothes before the damp ruins a day's work. Children scatter indoors. A cat leaps into a doorway. The entire street reacts as if someone rang an alarm. Surviving civic reports strongly indicate that repeated rainfall turned unpaved courts into swampy pits, spreading sickness and misery. You feel the mud cling to your boots within minutes. One unexpectedly offbeat detail from everyday practice involved people rubbing onions on windows to prevent frost from forming overnight. You see a woman doing it now, her motions brisk, her expression resigned. She knows it will not stop the cold entirely, but it might keep her pains clear enough to let a sliver of morning light through. Victorian weather demanded constant improvisation. Fog drifts in next, curling around your ankles like a familiar pet. London fog is not the soft romantic mist of paintings. It is heavier, greyer, tinged with coal. It flattens sound and blurs outlines until the world feels half undone. Some academic voices still question whether the worst fogs were as common as later writing implies, or whether memory intensified them over time. What cannot be disputed is your current reality. The fog steals detail from faces only steps away, and every lamplight glows like it is underwater. As the fog thickens, you hear footsteps approach, long before the person becomes visible. A woman carrying groceries emerges from the blur, clutching her shawl tightly. She walks slowly, touching walls to stay oriented. Debate continues over how accurately we can say that fog shaped public emotion. Some researchers argue it fostered caution and introspection. Others believe it created anxiety and disorientation. Standing here, you feel both at once. The world feels muted, yet unsettled as though something waits in the haze. Later in the week, the fog clears and heat rolls in. The air grows sticky, clinging to your skin. Horses slow to a tired plod. Shop windows open for air. A boy fans himself with a newspaper. Analysts studying the era reach sharply varied conclusions about whether heat or cold pose the greater danger to working families. Cold threatened lungs and empty coal bins. Heat soured meat, fouled milk, and spread disease. Both carried risks disguised as ordinary days. You find yourself following a lamplighter who wipes sweat from his brow as he works. His coat looks too heavy for the temperature, but it is required for his role. He pauses beneath a bridge to cool down, muttering about nights when lamps attracted swarms of insects. A little domestic eccentricity, mentioned in passing, was that some households burned dried rosemary in summer to mask the smell of spoiled food. You catch the faint herbal note, drifting from a window, fighting valiantly against the marketplace odours below. A storm breaks suddenly. Rain pounds rooftops like fists. Water streams along gutters carrying scraps of paper and fruit skins. Children rush out to splash barefoot in the puddles until a parent drags them inside. Men flip up coat collars and shout instructions to one another across the noise. Women hurry baskets under doorways. Yet even amid the chaos, someone laughs, delighted by the release of tension after a long, stifling day. When the storm passes, a golden light spreads over the street. The air smells clean for a rare moment. A shopkeeper sweeps water from his threshold, humming softly. Modern historians diverge significantly in explaining this pattern of collective mood shifts. Some argue that weather simply mirrored existing social tensions. Others believe it genuinely altered behaviour, softening or sharpening tempers in ways hard to quantify. Watching the transformation now, you feel how plausible the latter view is. The entire street seems to inhale differently. Seasons reshape work too. In winter, daylight fades early, pushing families indoors before supper. In summer, people linger outside, stretching their evenings with conversation or simple rest. Street sellers adjust their offerings, chestnuts in winter cherries, in summer ice chips, shaved from blocks when heat is unbearable. One small yet surprisingly odd custom of the time was the mixing of milk with crushed ice fetched from Norway on cargo ships. Londoners treated it like magic, a treat that tasted impossibly cold. As you continue walking, you reach a narrow court where residents gather to share news. Today, they speak of upcoming frost. Fear flickers across their expressions. Frost means higher coal costs, perhaps illness, perhaps worse. The weather is not just a topic, it is a form of prophecy. People listen to rumours of coming storms the way others read omens. Night arrives quietly. A soft breeze carries chimney smoke upward instead of down. It feels almost gentle, as if the city is trying to soothe itself. Yet even this calm has edges. You see a man covering his cart with an oilcloth, muttering about rain that might come while he sleeps. Weather in this city is never completely trustworthy. By the time you reach the end of the district, you realise Victorian London lives in a constant dance with climate. Fog shapes footsteps, rain shapes tempers, heat shapes hunger, cold shapes fear. The city is not defined by its buildings alone, but by the air that presses against every brick and bone. You turn into a dim side street where houses lean shoulder to shoulder, giving the impression that London itself is trying to sleep. But you soon discover that sleep here is not gentle, nor guaranteed, nor evenly granted. Victorian London dreams in fragments. The city snores, mutters, coughs, rattles, its shutters bangs its doors, and keeps entire families half awake through nights that feel longer than they should. A cart rolls past its wheels, clattering over loose stones. A dog barks somewhere behind you. A baby cries upstairs. In a window above, a woman blows out her lamp and lies down beside her children, all sharing one narrow mattress. One firmly documented aspect of daily life involved overcrowded sleeping arrangements. Beds sagged with weight, floors hosted makeshift pallets, attics held lodgers, wrapped in thin blankets. People slept not where they preferred, but wherever space and circumstance allowed. You enter a tenement where a family prepares for the night. The mother smooths a blanket over the children first. The father checks the latch twice. The room is small enough that you can touch both walls by stretching your arms. Modern analysts have yet to settle on whether such cramped sleeping conditions fostered emotional closeness or constant tension. Some diaries describe warm, shared comfort. Others whisper of sleepless irritability and stolen breaths. As you watch the family settle, you sense the truth flickers between both poles. Outside the window, a lamplighter makes his rounds. His footsteps echo along the pavement, steady as a heartbeat. Multiple period sources independently confirm that many Londoners judge time at night by the lamplighter's return journey. For people without clocks, his presence became a kind of nocturnal anchor, offering reassurance that the night had not swallowed the world entirely. Inside the room, the air thickens with breath and trapped heat. The father snores almost immediately, his exhaustion louder than discretion. The mother tosses briefly, already half dreaming, one hand resting protectively on the edge of the children's blanket. A curious micro-habit buried in household notes reveals that some families place bricks warmed at the hearth, under the bed covers, to take the edge off cold nights. On the floor by the bed, you find one such brick wrapped in an old rag, releasing its final thin warmth. A board creaks in the hallway. Somewhere a man coughs harshly. Another mutters in his sleep. Sounds in buildings like these travel freely, slipping through cracks, drifting under doorways, tapping into the shared nocturnal awareness. Research communities remain unsettled on whether London tenants truly adapted to such constant noise or simply learned to act as though they had. Some memoirs describe deep sleep amid chaos. Others recall restless nights stitched with every neighbour's whisper. You slip outside again, stepping into the cooler night air, where the city reveals new layers of its soundtrack. Horses clop past at irregular intervals. A distant factory lets out a metallic groan as machinery settles for the night. The Thames sighs under the weight of current and tide. Analysts studying the era reach sharply varied conclusions about how noise affected Victorian health, yet many surviving letters hint that people grew used to exhaustion as a permanent state. They treated fatigue like weather expected, endured, rarely questioned. You walk further and find a man sleeping upright against a wall, wrapped in a coat too thin for the season. He startles awake when a constable approaches, but relaxes when the officer nods politely and moves on. A little domestic eccentricity mentioned in passing was that some labourers kept small stones in their pockets to wedge under their boots when sleeping outdoors, preventing rollaway or theft. You see one at the man's feet, carefully placed, his only safeguard for the night. In another house, you watch a maid climb the narrow attic stairs to her small room. She whispers a prayer before lying down, clutching her apron to her chest like a blanket. Servants' quarters are notoriously cold. The roof above her creaks in the wind, and the wall she sleeps against collects the night's chill like a sponge. Eyewitness accounts confirm that maids often slept lightly, rising at the slightest sound to begin chores before dawn. For them, rest is neither full nor fair. Further along in a wealthier district, you find a man reading a newspaper by candlelight, while his wife sleeps in an adjoining room. Separate bedrooms are meant to signal refinement, but you notice the loneliness in his posture. Surviving documentation shows that solitude at night, though rarer among the poor, carried its own aches. Silence can weigh as heavily as noise. Then there are the boarding houses, where travellers, clerks, sailors and widowers lie awake, listening to strangers breathing beside them. Beds line the room in two neat rows. The smell of damp wool hangs thick. One man sleeps with his boots under his pillow to prevent theft. Another drapes a coat over his face to block a lantern's glow. A third whispers a dream, aloud his voice drifting through the room like a wandering spirit. Academic circles persist in debating how far such shared environments shaped Victorian understandings of privacy. The concept itself feels slippery here, something imagined more than lived. Somewhere down the street a clock strikes 2. The neighbourhood shifts slightly, like a sleeper turning over. Windows glow briefly as people rouse for newborns, nightmares or coughs. A woman steps onto her stoop to take a breath of cold air, before returning to a restless husband. A child whimpers, dreaming of hunger or fear. The city keeps partial watch over them all. As the night stretches on, you feel how sleep in Victorian London is rarely gentle. It is fragmented, borrowed, negotiated. People steal moments of rest where they can find them against fireplaces, over rope beds, under shared blankets, on benches in corners. And still the city moves around them, noisy, heavy breathing in irregular rhythms. By the time dawn begins its pale climb over rooftops, you understand something important. Sleep here is not measured by comfort, but by necessity. People rest because they must, because another day waits bursting with noise and labour, because their bodies demand it even when their surroundings refuse to cooperate. You walk onward, sensing the faint stirrings of morning routines rising from beds, hearths and stairways. The city is waking, but you have one more layer of London to explore the flickers of change that crept into old routines as the century turned. You turn toward a district where the city feels restless in a different way, as though London itself is preparing for something it cannot yet name. The 19th century is shifting under your feet. New machines appear in workshops. Railways carve fresh lines across the map. Newspapers multiply. Clocks grow more precise. Expectations tighten. Opinions quicken. Victorian London is not a static world at all, but a city in motion, adapting unevenly to the pace of modernity long before the term modern existed. Near a busy junction, a young clerk hurries past his coat flapping behind him. He checks his watch twice in 10 steps, worried he might be late for work. A commonly substantiated feature of 19th century London life was that punctuality became a new social virtue. Factories, offices, shops, trains, and even household routines increasingly revolved around strict timetables. Time itself hardened, losing its older, slower elasticity. Workers streamed toward various jobs, many carrying lunch tins or folded newspapers. Records preserved from the period repeatedly affirm that literacy expanded dramatically during these years. New schools, cheap print, and mass publishing brought a wave of readers into daily streets. You see evidence everywhere: a costermonger reading an advertisement aloud to friends, a maid clutching a romance serial, a man scanning job listings over breakfast. A small but charmingly odd detail from daily practice was that some households pinned newspaper scraps behind wall cracks to block drafts. You notice one such scrap fluttering behind a dresser, promising a sale on umbrellas from a shop that closed years ago. The paper has outlived its original purpose, now serving as insulation for a wall that refuses to keep the cold out. Down another street you find a group of men clustered around a storefront window, displaying new machines, sewing devices, mechanical toys and gleaming tools. They marvel at the gears, knobs and polished surfaces. Some historians still weigh competing interpretations of whether Victorian working people felt excitement or anxiety when faced with new technology. Letters show both reactions. Some embraced innovations eagerly. Others feared job loss or moral decline. Watching the men now, you sense a mixture of curiosity and caution. You enter a small workshop where the air buzzes with fresh rhythms. Spinning belts whir, metal clicks, wood shavings scatter across the floor. A young apprentice adjusts a pulley with fumbling precision. Contemporary testimony across classes indicates clearly that mechanization brought new forms of labour faster, more regulated, sometimes safer, sometimes more hazardous. The old handcraft methods still linger, but the machines have begun to reshape the tempo, demanding steadier focus and quicker reflexes. Further along, you find a seamstress working by lamplight. Her fingers move swiftly, guided by habit rather than sight. She mentions a new factory that might hire additional workers soon, though she does not know whether the wages offered will truly help her family. There is ongoing academic uncertainty about whether industrial expansion meaningfully improved the lives of working-class women or simply intensified their burdens. Different neighbourhoods tell different stories. A modest yet amusing habit some Londoners followed involves saving odd bits of string from parcels to weave into makeshift clotheslines or lamp poles. You see one dangling from a basement window, a cheerful testament to human creativity in a city that often demanded frugality. The string extends down a wall as though pointing toward unseen stories below. You stop near a railway station where steam clouds billow outward. People wait with varied expressions: impatience, hope, nerves, boredom. Trains altered everything. Travel accelerated. Goods circulated faster. Families separated and reunited more easily. Researchers remain divided on whether trains primarily unified the city or fractured old neighbourhood bonds. Some letters speak of new opportunities. Others mourn the loss of quiet rhythms replaced by schedules and smoke. Inside the station, a vendor sells illustrated magazines full of marvels, electricity experiments, foreign discoveries, new scientific theories. Children's eyes widen at sketches of submarines and flying machines. Specialists continue to debate the extent to which such optimism reached the poorest Londoners. Some surely felt inspired. Others, struggling to afford supper, likely walked past without a glance. Your path leads into a small library where a woman places returned books onto shelves. She whispers to a visiting girl about the worlds contained in each volume. A firmly grounded observation made by social investigators notes that public libraries emerged as crucial meeting points for education, self-improvement, and social mobility. Yet access varied wildly by district. Some neighbourhoods cherished libraries, others had none. A man reading in the corner closes his book slowly, as though tasting the last sentence. His coat is patched, his boots worn, yet his eyes glow with thought. Modern researchers trace several plausible pathways through the data when analysing how intellectual culture spread through working populations. Some gained transformative opportunities, others encountered only small flashes of inspiration before reality intervened. Out on the next street, posters flap against walls, advertising lectures, political meetings, union gatherings, and exhibitions. Londoners are talking, organising, arguing. Newspapers also report new inventions. Arriving soon, electric lighting, faster printing presses, medical developments. A gently peculiar routine noted in household diaries reveals that families sometimes cut out exciting announcements and pasted them into scrapbooks, believing they were documenting history as it unfolded. You see one of these scrapbooks in a second-hand stall, its pages filled with bold headlines and hopeful predictions. Evenings now carry a different energy. Gas lamps allow later shopping. Clubs remain open longer. Workers find hours to gather, sing, debate, dream. The city feels stretched, its days lengthening to meet new ambitions. Analysts confronting the material reach no single cohesive conclusion about whether these changes made life better. They brought opportunity and strain in equal measure. As night deepens, you notice something subtle. People walk a little faster, as though drawn forward by invisible momentum. Children speak with curiosity about futures that once felt unimaginable. Women talk about rights, education possibilities. Men discuss wages, safety, time off. The city is not fully modern yet, but it is restless, shifting, feeling its way toward a new century with a mixture of hope and unease. Victorian London, often imagined as frozen in smoke and soot, is in fact pulsing with transition. Lives are stretching beyond old boundaries. Ideas flutter like sparks from unseen wires. You leave the district sensing that change has stitched itself into every street, preparing the city for a morning that has not yet arrived but is already taking shape in the hearts of the people walking beside you. You move into a quieter quarter where the streets narrow and soften, as if London itself is growing reflective after the long journey you have taken through its hidden rooms. The lamps glow with a warmer hue, footsteps slow, voices fall to murmurs behind curtained windows. Victorian London, for all its noise and hardship, has a private side that rarely appears in history books. The moments people steal for themselves, the quiet rituals that help them endure, the small comforts that stitch the edges of life back together after each exhausting day. You wander past a row of modest homes where families prepare for evening in ways shaped by routine as much as necessity. A woman lights a final candle and places it on a low table. A man unlaces his boots, sighing with the relief that comes only after long hours of work. A child hums softly while brushing crumbs into a neat pile. Records preserved from the period repeatedly affirm that households relied on predictable evening rituals to create pockets of calm in a city that often felt overwhelming. Familiar patterns anchored them amid constant uncertainty. Inside one home, a mother braids her daughter's hair while telling a story about her own childhood. The rhythm of her voice mingles with the scraping of a chair and the distant clop of a passing horse. Researchers remain divided on whether such domestic storytelling served primarily educational purposes or emotional ones. Some argue parents used tales to pass on values. Others believe these stories simply soothed the mind after relentless days. Watching the pair now, you sense both interpretations have weight. A modest yet amusing habit some Londoners followed involved placing dried orange peels near the hearth to scent the evening air. You see a small bowl of them on a mantelpiece, their fragrance faint but comforting. The family treats the scent like a small luxury one that costs nothing but feels like a reward for surviving another day. In a nearby attic room, a tailor carefully folds his tools before resting his hands on the table for a quiet moment. His shoulders sag with fatigue, yet he hums a tune under his breath. A firmly grounded observation made by social investigators notes that many workers, despite staggering hours, sought brief personal rituals such as music reading or silent contemplation to retain a sense of self beyond their labour. These rituals were not leisure as we understand it today. They were maintenance for the soul. You step outside again and find an elderly woman polishing a teacup slowly, almost reverently. Her movements carry a tenderness that does not need words. Some historians still weigh competing interpretations of whether such gestures reflected pride, scarcity, or simple habit. Perhaps the distinctions do not matter. The cup shines, her breath slows. She has carved a moment of stillness from a life that rarely offers it. Further along, a young couple sits on a doorstep sharing a blanket. They speak in whispers, glancing occasionally at the street to ensure privacy. Posters nearby announce political meetings, mechanical wonders, performances, and scientific lectures. The world is expanding around them, offering new choices and new complications. Specialists continue to debate the extent to which ordinary Londoners felt swept up in these shifts, or merely brushed by them. The couple seems aware of change, but not consumed by it. What matters to them is this shared quiet, the borrowed warmth of the evening. A little later, you follow a narrow passage into a courtyard where several neighbours gather informally. One man repairs a chair. A woman peels vegetables for tomorrow. A child rolls a hoop in small circles. The courtyard fills with the faint sound of humming chores, done more slowly now that the day's urgency has faded. Contemporary testimony across classes indicates clearly that such communal evening moments offered a sense of belonging in neighbourhoods that otherwise felt strained by hardship. A small but charmingly odd detail from daily practice was that some families saved candle ends, melting them into new, makeshift tapers for late-night tasks. A girl demonstrates this now, pouring the wax carefully into a chipped mould. Her mother praises her steadiness. The task is simple, but the pride in her eyes is unmistakable. In families where money was tight, mastering such frugal crafts became a quiet triumph. Down the road, a man sits on a bench reading a borrowed newspaper while the last of the daylight holds on. Analysts confronting the material reach no single cohesive conclusion about whether evening reading signaled genuine relaxation or anxious attempts to keep pace with a fast-changing world. But in this moment, the man's face looks peaceful, his posture loose, his mind drifting gently over printed lines. Whatever purpose reading serves tonight, it gives him rest. You pass a small pub where laughter floats into the street. A quartet of labourers sings a rough but joyful tune. Their happiness is not grand, not carefree. It is earned. A temporary balm. Inside, the atmosphere glows with shared fatigue and shared camaraderie. Many Londoners across classes relied on such togetherness to soften the city's sharper corners. As you move on, the streets grow quieter. Children are put to bed. Candles burn low. The bakery shutters close. A cat curls on a stoop. Current scholarship remains split into rival explanatory camps when it comes to interpreting whether Victorian evenings represented true rest or simply preparation for another round of struggle. Walking now through the calm, you feel how deeply evenings mattered, regardless of interpretation. They were not perfect refuges, but fragile sanctuaries assembled from scraps of time. You reach the final stretch of the street where the city exhales into night. A woman shuts her door gently, then stands for a moment in the cool air, breathing slowly. A man extinguishes his lantern. Window panes hold warm glimmers of firelight before dimming to embers. The day's noise becomes a distant memory, replaced by soft rhythms of settling bodies and easing minds. And then you realise something simple and profound. For all the era's harshness, all its smoke hunger, crowding, labour fear, and constant negotiation, people still found ways to end their days, with small acts of gentleness. A cup warmed between hands, a lullaby hummed softly, a chair repaired, a story shared, a candle lit for an extra moment of brightness. These moments do not erase hardship, they coexist with it. Yet they reveal a truth about Victorian London that historians sometimes forget to emphasise. Resilience was not loud, it was quiet. It lived in tiny rituals repeated night after night, by people who refused to let the world's weight crush their inner light. As you pause at the street's edge, you feel that light still flickering behind the windows, fragile but enduring, warming the edges of a city too often described only by its shadows. The city settles now softer than you have ever seen it. The lamps flicker into a gentle hush and the streets draw a long, slow breath, as if letting the night cradle them at last. You feel the pace of everything around you loosen. Footsteps fade, voices dim, curtains fall still against window panes. The world narrows to a few tender sounds, a kettle cooling a child, murmuring in sleep, the low rustle of bedding as someone turns over in a quiet room. Let your own breathing fall into that rhythm. Longer inhales, softer exhales. The weight of the day begins to slide away, replaced by something calmer, something lighter. The stories you have walked through tonight blur gently into the background, no longer sharp or demanding, just drifting shapes settling into silence. Imagine the whole of London sleeping now, each house glowing faintly, with its own tiny ember of warmth. Imagine yourself, wrapped in that warmth, too safe and unhurried. Let the city's distant heartbeat lull you, its slow pulse guiding you toward rest. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Only this stillness holding you softly as you drift. End of script. Sweet dreams.